Chapter 176. Chen Pipi sincerely praised him, "That's a good sentence." Ning Ke shrugged and said, "I often say beautiful words that even I don't expect." The two looked at each other and then laughed. The melodious music floating on the cliff platform had stopped. Ning Ke got a temporary answer to the problem of obsession and happiness in life, and he was no longer as anxious and impetuous as before. He and Chen Pipi walked down the hill side by side, wondering if they should go to the old library for a nap. After returning to Lin 47th Street, perhaps he could take Sang Sang to go shopping and relax. Unexpectedly, the dense forest beside the road shook, and two people came out of it. Fortunately, there were two people who appeared, so it could not be the most helpless and painful 11th senior brother. Unfortunately, these two people were carrying a zither and a flute in their arms. Their academy uniforms were wide and large. They were Beigong and Shimen, the two senior brothers who were obsessed with music. "Youngest brother, I saw that you didn't nod frequently when listening to the song yesterday, so I guessed that there must be something wrong with the song." Ninth brother Beigong Weiyang's eyes were also bloodshot. He pulled Ning Ke's sleeve enthusiastically and said, "Last night, Shimen and I stayed up all night and made some adjustments to the three connecting bars of the song. We are satisfied with it, but it's a song made by ourselves after all. It doesn't count if you're deaf and blind. We still need you to appreciate it." 10th brother Shimen Buhua held the zither and said sincerely, "Youngest brother, thank you for your hard work." Chen Pipi looked at Ning Ke sympathetically and thought that Ning Ke had just figured out those things on the spiritual level, but the chores around him were bothering him. As the youngest person in the back mountain of the academy, it was so painful that it made him want to cry. Ning Ke was slightly stunned. He looked at the two senior brothers in front of him and thought of the old man who was focused on reading beside the cliff cave. After a moment of silence, he smiled and bowed with hands folded in front and said calmly, "Two senior brothers, please forgive me for not listening to the song today." "What can you do if you don't listen to the song? Are those guys asking you to play chess and debate?" Beigong Weiyang flicked his sleeves and said unhappily, "Little brother, don't make things difficult for yourself. I will stand up for you. Don't they know how precious your time is?" Hearing this, Ning Ke couldn't help but laugh. He shook his head and said, "Ninth brother, I won't listen to music or play chess today, nor will I accompany 11th brother in his mental wandering. I just want to have a good sleep." Beigong Weiyang widened his eyes and asked in confusion, "Little junior brother, why aren't you listening to music?" Ning Ke replied gently, "Because I don't like it." Beigong Weiyang was stunned. Stroking the bamboo flute in his hand, he said in distress, "I can't. You seemed very happy listening to it the last few times." Ning Ke said with a smile, "That's to make my two senior brothers happy. In fact, I'm not that happy myself." Senior brother Shimen Buhua interrupted, "Little junior brother, you kept nodding your head while listening to the music." Ning Ke sighed and said, "I was so sleepy that I wanted to sleep." Chen Pipi couldn't help but be dumbfounded at the conversation between Ning Ke and his two senior brothers. He gently pulled Ning Ke's sleeves and pulled him aside. He reminded him in a low voice, "How can you talk to your senior brothers like this? Don't say it if you don't like it." Ning Ke looked at him and said in distress, "But I'm telling the truth." At this moment, a calm and serious voice came from the top of the mountain path. Hearing this voice, both the two senior brothers who were in a daze and Chen Pipi who was ready to continue to criticize and remind Ning Ke became more obedient in an instant. "Don't listen to it if you don't like it. Speak the truth and deal with things straightforwardly. That's what a gentleman should do." Second brother, who was wearing an ancient crown, walked down from the top of the mountain path with a solemn expression. He nodded slightly and greeted his junior brothers. Then he said with an undisguised expression of admiration, "Little junior brother is quite a gentleman. You should learn from him." Hearing the praise, Ning Ke was stunned. This was the first time that he was associated with such a strange creature as a gentleman. Second brother looked at him with a smile and nodded. Then he stopped smiling and looked seriously at Chinpipi and the other two junior brothers. He said in a low voice, "From today on, no one is allowed to disturb little junior brother's cultivation. Otherwise, I'll punish you according to the academy rules." His voice was not very loud, but it seemed to have a substantial existence. It did not dissipate even though it floated far away. Along with the mountain forest wind, it quickly spread through the whole back of the mountain and spread to the lake pavilion under the pine trees and flowers. All the junior brothers and sisters could hear it clearly. Baigong Weiyang and Shiman Buhua agreed with a bitter face. But they could not help sneaking a glance at Ning Quebec. They were probably still regretting that they had finally found a junior brother who was sensitive to the beauty of rhythm, but he was taken away by second brother. Eldest brother ranked first in the back of the mountain of the academy. However, eldest brother's temperament was extremely gentle. The junior brothers and sisters were close to him without fear. What they really respected was this upright and serious second brother. As long as second brother said it, no one dared to disobey. Thinking that Ning Ke would not need to be bothered by these senior brothers and sisters from now on, and thinking of his bloody life when he just entered the back of the mountain, Chinpipi was very envious of his luck. He was a little angry and unreconciled. He looked at second brother and asked seriously, "Senior brother, the array of the cloud gate is now being repaired, and seventh sister needs Ning Ke's help every day. What do you think?" There was an unfinished meaning in his words, which implied that he was up to no good. Ning Ke glared at Chinpipi, and Chinpipi looked back at him proudly. However, he did not feel proud for long. The next moment, he heard second brother's words and understood that talking too much often brought great misfortune to people. The array of the cloud gate has not been repaired yet. What has seventh sister been doing in the past 6 months? Practicing the array. Well, it is indeed a little troublesome. Little junior brother has just entered the sect and has no time to waste on these things. Pippi, I remember that you repaired the array of the cloud gate with seventh sister the year before last. Since you have experience, you have to work hard this year. Chinpipi opened his mouth wide and wanted to cry but had no tears. Little junior brother, come with me. Second brother put his sleeves behind his back and walked down the mountain slowly. Ning Ke patted Chinpipi's shoulder sympathetically and caught up with him. In the chat with Chinpipi and other senior brothers and sisters, Ning Ke knew that second brother was an extremely proud and serious person. He was very strict to himself and others, so he was a little afraid of him. However, today second brother solved a big problem for him, so his impression of second brother suddenly changed. He felt that second brother was definitely the most lovely person in the world. The psychological state would definitely affect the reality. He followed second brother slowly to the mirror lake on the cliff plateau. Looking at second brother's old-fashioned posture and the rigid taste of the same distance in every step, all changed into admirable rigorous self-discipline. Even the high crown on second brother's head, which was like a washing stick, became a lot more noble at this time. Second brother suddenly sighed with emotion and said, "Your state is really too low." Hearing second brother's words in front of him, Ning Ke quickly quickened his pace and came behind him. He answered honestly, "Yes. The back of the mountain of the academy has no experience in the education of disciples in the no-doubt state." Second brother shook his head slowly and said, although eldest brother was still in the initial state when he entered the academy, he was taught by the headmaster himself. But now the headmaster and eldest brother are still traveling outside, even I don't know how to teach you. Ning Ke was silent. Hearing that second brother was going to teach the new youngest brother Haran sword, the back mountain of the academy, which had been quiet for a long time, finally ushered in a rare bustle. Those senior brothers and sisters who usually lived in different places all came out of their rooms under the pine trees and flowers. They stood everywhere on the cliff plateau and curiously looked at the two people by the mirror lake, pointing at them and whispering from time to time. Baigong Weiyang squatted under the bamboo forest and looked at the two who were talking by the lake. He could not help but shake his head and said, "What's so good about learning flying sword? It has no sense of beauty at all. What else can it do except to kill people?" Fifth brother and eighth brother came out of the bamboo forest with chess boxes in their arms. Fifth brother ruthlessly slapped Beigong's head and scolded, "The tiger is quite beautiful. Why don't you go to hug and kiss it? The difference between a man and a beast is not beauty, but wisdom. What future can he have if he learns to play the flute from you?" Fifth brother looked at the lake and shook his head disapprovingly, saying, "Youngest brother has really gone astray by learning flying sword from second brother. If he learns chess with us, even if he can't become a national player, he can at least gain some wisdom." Beigong Weiyang looked at him angrily and said, "Fifth brother, wisdom is not violence. You don't have to hit my head even if you don't agree with me." Fifth brother glared at him and said, "I am your senior brother. Are you not convinced that I hit you?" Beigong Weiyang moved aside and muttered, "Of course I am. How dare I not? But since it is second brother who wants youngest brother to learn flying sword, don't complain here." Not to mention those who looked gloomy all over the cliff plateau, some of whom, like 11, beat their chests and stamped their feet, thinking that their youngest brother had been led astray by second brother. Second brother and Ning Kei were having a serious conversation by the mirror lake, wrapped in the gentle wind of late spring. Although you have read Wu Zhenyang's theory on Haran sword, this monograph was written by Mr. Wu, a former sage of the academy in his later years. Its main purpose is to explore the interaction and conflict between Haran sword and heaven and earth. Second brother looked at Ning Kei and said, "This book focuses more on the Tao outside the Tao, which is not something you can fully grasp with your current state. So since you want to learn Haran sword, you have to learn from the most basic things." Ning Kei bowed with hands folded in front and said, "Second brother, please enlighten me. Flying sword is a sword that can fly without human control." Second brother said calmly. Second brother is really good at talking nonsense. Ning Kei couldn't calm down and thought silently in his heart. Controlling the chi of heaven and earth with psyche power, touching and controlling the sword body invisibly, and moving the sword around the body is the simplest way of flying sword. The power of flying sword lies in 3 points: the strength of the sword master's psyche power, the amount of chi of heaven and earth that can be controlled, the strength of the connection with the sword body, the strength of the sword body itself, and the subtlety of the flying sword body. You are still in the no-doubt state, but you can already touch and even control foreign objects, which shows that your psyche power is strong enough and the connection with foreign objects is good. But there is another point based on talent, that is, the amount of chi of heaven and earth that you can control. Second brother looked at his eyes and said calmly, "You can see the amount of chi of heaven and earth that a sword master can control as an invisible rope in his hand. The more chi of heaven and earth you can control, the stronger and longer the invisible rope will be. Only a rope that is strong and long enough can drive the sword body to fly a longer distance without worrying about getting out of control." Ning Kei said, "I understand." Second brother looked at him and said, "The so-called swordsmanship is actually a different way of controlling the chi of heaven and earth with psyche power to control the sword body. The Haran sword would rather take the straight than seek the crooked one. It emphasizes on having a firm heart and a firm will. You can use the sword without hesitation and break all obstacles. As for how to do it, you should listen to the Haran sword tactics that I will teach you." "Thank you, senior brother. Do you remember it?" "I remember half of it." "Then I will say it again." "Yes." Ning Kei suddenly felt that this dialogue was very familiar and thought that he had to answer that he had forgotten all of it later. Then second brother brushed his academy uniform and laughed loudly, saying, "Little younger brother, you have understood it. Then go to the dark side and kill all the thieves." Second brother frowned and asked, "What about now?" Ning Kei came to his senses and of course did not dare to answer like that. He answered honestly, "I remember all of it." Second brother's eyebrows gradually relaxed and he praised, "Little younger brother's comprehension is really excellent. As soon as he finished speaking, he casually waved his hand in the spring breeze by the lakeside and a short and thin wooden sword without a handle appeared in his hand. He handed the hiltless wooden sword to Ning Ke and said, "I have said before that we should start from the most basic. Show me your sword first." Ning Ke took the hiltless wooden sword and felt a little cold in his fingers. For a moment, he was a little confused. After a moment of silence, he took a deep breath and said, "Okay." The disciples of the second floor of the academy who were watching around the mirror lake saw that Ning Ke was finally going to show his sword. They all stood up and watched with curiosity on their faces. Although at this moment they still insisted that it was a very wrong choice for Ning Ke to learn the flying sword, which was neither beautiful nor wise to kill people, they were also very curious about Ning Ke's level. Ning Ke slowly closed his eyes and felt the weight of the hiltless wooden sword in his hands. He felt that the originally light wooden sword was getting heavier and heavier. The psyche power in his sense of perception was driven out of his body and blended with the surrounding chi of heaven and earth. It vaguely touched the place where the wooden sword was and then wrapped the chi of heaven and earth around it according to the method taught by second brother. Up. Ning Ke opened his eyes and looked at the hiltless wooden sword in his hand. He shouted in a low voice and the psyche power in his sense of perception gushed out. The chi of heaven and earth wrapped around the sword suddenly tightened and then violently vibrated. In the spring breeze by the mirror lake, a thin hiltless wooden sword trembled and flew up. The thin hiltless wooden sword flew very slowly and trembled uneasily, as if it was extremely frightened. The wooden sword moved slowly in the air and it was very difficult and strenuous to fly. Moreover, the wooden sword moved without any regular trajectory. One moment it was on the right side of Ning Ke's body, and the next moment it was on the left side of Ning Ke's body. One moment it jumped up, and the next moment it was about to fall into the lake. The wooden sword stopped in the air and looked like an old woman with small feet without a sense of direction. The disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy who were watching by the lake opened their mouths wide and could not close them for a long time. The embroidery needle between seventh sister's fingers in the pavilion at the center of the lake fell into the lake and was swallowed by a greedy golden carp. Beigong Weiyang stood at the edge of the bamboo forest and looked at the hiltless wooden sword in the air by the lake. He said with a serious expression, "I think the sword will feel ashamed to use the word fly to describe this sword." Chen Pipi, who was standing not far away, lowered his head in shame and did not want to admit that the person by the lake was his friend. The hiltless wooden sword flew back, trembling. Ning Ke opened his eyes wide and saw that it was about to fall. He stretched out his hand like lightning and caught it in his hand. He could not help but feel a little scared. He wiped the sweat on his forehead and turned to second brother and asked excitedly, "Senior brother, what do you think of me?" The excitement on his face was genuine. He looked at Ning Ke's pale face and suddenly said after a moment of silence, "There are some things that can't be solved by risking one's life." Ning Ke looked up at the blue sky and white clouds and said with a smile, "In the past, you said that cultivation is a gift from Haotian and we can't force it. If we can't cultivate, we can't cultivate. But at least I can cultivate now." Chen Pipi shook his head and said, "But if you always try so hard, how can your body bear it?" "I don't try so hard. I just like it." Ning Ke glanced at him and picked up the hiltless sword beside him. He waved it casually in the air and said with a smile, "One day, I will make this sword become a flying sword. Recommendation votes and monthly votes. I shout with a hoarse voice. Now I realize that I really have to fight for these things. Just saying that I like them is not enough. Give them to me, to be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 177. The old brush pen shop had a front shop and a backyard, but the place was too small. It was too dangerous to use the old woman's flying sword here. It didn't matter if the flowers and plants were hurt, but did he want Sang Sang to wash the rice and cook with the big black umbrella? So Ning Kai didn't practice his swordsmanship after returning to Lin 47th Street. He stood in front of the desk again, dipped the brush in ink, and stared at the snow-white book paper. Today he didn't stare blankly like a statue. He took deep breaths from time to time, paced back and forth, raised his eyebrows, and even faintly heard him humming a tune. The brush in his right hand was not as heavy as it was a few days ago, but hung in the air easily and drew at a distance. Although he still didn't write, he seemed to be much more relaxed. Sang Sang cut the pumpkin into vertical strips and put them on the rice bowl to steam. She entered the inner room to untie her apron and saw this scene. She curiously watched Ning Kai circling the desk and drawing in the air with the brush in his hand. After a while, she felt a little dizzy and said while covering her forehead, "Young master, I'm really itchy. Let's try writing a few lines." Ning Kai stopped jumping and said with a smile, "You know it won't work. Why bother trying?" Sang Sang wiped her wet hands and said with a smile, "Even if it doesn't work, I can still sell some ink balls." Ning Kai laughed when he heard this. Sang Sang suddenly realized and looked at Ning Kai in surprise. She wondered what happened today. Young master didn't become an idiot when he picked up the brush and still had the energy to chat with her. Then Ning Kai ate with her. After dinner, he asked her to make a pot of tea and moved the armchair to the small courtyard. They sat and chatted while watching the stars, drinking tea, and chatting. He seemed to be extremely relaxed and happy. When the lights were turned on at night, he walked into the room, took off his coat and leaned against the bed. He took out a book from nowhere and read it attentively. His eyebrows were slightly raised from time to time and his fingers were rubbing slowly. Sang Sang walked into the room with water to wash his feet. She couldn't help feeling puzzled as she thought of the many strange things that happened tonight. After living together for so many years, she knew very well that Ning Kai would work hard like a few days ago when he was stuck in a difficult problem. She really couldn't understand why he suddenly became so relaxed today. Could it be that he was desperate to solve that problem? "Young master, what book are you reading?" She looked at the old book in Ning Kai's hand and asked. Ning Kai was stunned by her question. He glanced at the erotic book that he had secretly brought out from the cliff cave at the back of the mountain of the academy. He coughed twice to cover up his embarrassment and turned around to avoid her gaze. He said, "You're still too young to read those things between men and women." Sang Sang took off his shoes and socks, then moved a stool to sit on the other side of the basin. She patted his thigh and motioned him to put his feet in the basin. She said, "It's just some romantic stuff between scholars and beauties. What's there to see?" Ning Kai said with a smile, "You don't understand the beauty of this. Ouch. It's so comfortable. Don't scratch my feet." On the cliff plateau at the back of the academy, the fog had faded and the scenery was quiet and elegant. The water wheel behind the house was spinning and the dull sound of iron striking could be heard from time to time in the house. Then with a sizzling sound, the room was filled with water mist. In a dark corner, fourth brother was observing the direction of the talisman lines on the sand table by the glimmer of light from the window. When the steam came to his face, he slightly frowned and waved his hand to disperse it. But his eyes were still fixed on the sand table and he looked extremely focused. Those inexplicably complicated and inexplicable lines on the sand table moved slowly, following some indescribable law and extending toward each other. When they finally touched each other, the lines changed again and were about to combine into a new pattern. Fourth brother's eyes became brighter and brighter, but his face became paler and paler. Looking at his dignified expression, it could be seen that this talisman deduction had reached the most critical moment. However, at this moment, there was a panicked cry on the cliff plateau outside the house, followed by a faint sound of breaking wind. A gray shadow of a sword flew into the door crookedly. The sixth senior brother, who was concentrating on smithing, suddenly raised his thick eyebrows. His right hand picked up the heavy iron hammer as if he was holding a piece of paper and smashed it towards the sword shadow. This smash was indescribably heavy, as if it was light and wonderful to the extreme. It was absolutely impossible to swing such a delicate and accurate hammer without dozens of years of smithing with the hammer day after day. However, because of the controller's panic and terrible ability, although the grey shadow of the sword was extremely slow, it flew crookedly and irregularly. Because of its irregular speed, it seemed a little elusive. Sometimes it raised its head up like the proud second brother, and sometimes it hovered in the air and swayed like the philosophical 11th brother. It really did not take the usual path. It randomly and coincidentally avoided the swing of 6th brother's iron hammer and flew to the dark corner with a swoosh. With a snap, the handleless flying sword hit deeply into the sand table in the corner. The sword body slightly trembled, and the tip of the sword accurately hit the intersection of the talisman lines. It could be seen that those lines suddenly broke inch by inch like a freed rope, no longer in the same situation as before. Holding the iron hammer, 6th brother glanced at the sand table in the corner and smiled honestly. Then he turned around and continued to forge iron. 4th brother, who had been concentrating on the sand table and did not notice the flying sword at all, finally reacted at this time. Looking at the broken lines on the sand table, his face suddenly became extremely pale, and his body violently trembled because of anger. A figure appeared at the door, panting and smiling obsequiously. "Senior brothers, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." 4th brother suddenly turned around and stared at the clean and lovely face at the door, as if he had seen the dirtiest and most abominable thing in the world. His pale face suddenly turned red, and he heavily hit the sand table and roared, "Ning Ke. Can you find a place where there is no one? This is the 3rd time. If there is a next time, I will tear you apart." As the saying goes, people make mistakes, horses make mistakes, and the headmaster of academy also has times when he is hungry. I just started to cultivate Haren's sword, so it is understandable that I made some mistakes. I really don't understand why 4th brother is so angry. Ning Ke walked along the lake with the wooden sword and muttered, "Fortunately, 6th brother didn't hit the sword with his hammer, or the sword would have been smashed, and I would have to ask 2nd brother for it." His ability to control the flying sword was really terrible now. He had 10 acupoints in the ocean of chi and mountain of snow, but he could only control a little chi of heaven and earth. The transmission was not smooth, so his command of the grassroots troops was naturally very poor. It was basically wishful thinking for him to attack wherever he wanted, and it was common for him to point here and there. Bypassing the mirror lake, he came to a dense forest, across the lake from 6th brother's ironmaking room. He thought that with his state of cultivation, even if he exploded his small universe, he could not fly the sword to the other side of the lake. His heart suddenly calmed down, and he adjusted his breath. After a moment of meditation, he urged his psyche power, and the wooden sword spread out in both hands flew into the air again and slowly circled around his head twice. Looking up at the flying sword dancing against the blue sky, Ning Ke felt extremely satisfied and murmured in admiration, "This feeling is really good. Although I can't use it to kill people, it is also good to use it to perform magic tricks." Just as he was thinking about this, the hiltless flying sword instantly broke away from the control of his psyche power. With a sudden sound, it rushed down from the sky, and the tip of the sword pointed directly at his face. He was so scared that he hugged his head and directly lay on the ground, extremely embarrassed. Before the flying sword was about to land, it was not known whether it had received the response of his psyche power or some other reason, but it strangely shook itself forcibly and flew up again. With a swoosh, it brushed his scalp and flew diagonally into the dense forest. Lying on the ground, Ning Ke stretched out his fingers to pinch a sword formula, and found that the flying sword had broken away from the perception of his sense of perception. He climbed up while cursing, "This disobedient little thing." At this moment, there was a rustling sound in the dense forest. 9th brother Beigong Weiyang came out with one hand covering his forehead, and the other hand holding the flute and the flying sword. He looked very miserable. Ninth brother walked up to Ning Kai and looked at him expressionlessly. Then he pointed to his forehead, picked up the flute and gently tapped the wooden sword twice, and said with a dignified expression, "Youngest brother, you don't have this talent, so don't force yourself. If you continue to practice like this, it doesn't matter if you hurt us senior brothers and sisters, but if you scare away the birds in the forest, do you want to listen to our flute and zither music?" Ning Kai held back his laughter and stepped forward to take the wooden sword. Suddenly he thought of something and said with a smile, "Ninth brother, if there are no birds in the forest to listen to the wonderful music, then why don't you play a song for me?" In the pavilion in the middle of the lake, seventh sister was embroidering while humming a soft and pleasant southern song. Suddenly, she slightly raised her eyebrows and turned her wrist. The thin embroidery needle pinched between her fingers made a horrible air-breaking sound, and very accurately flicked away the wooden sword that flew out of nowhere near her right cheek. With a clap, the wooden sword fell into the lake and sank to the bottom. Ning Kai ran to the lakeside, panting, and waved to her in the pavilion. He said, "Seventh sister, can you help youngest brother to call the flying sword up? I have fished in the lake 3 times today, and I really have no clothes to change into." Seventh sister slightly frowned, looked at him and said, "I don't want to talk to you. The dignified Haran sword has been practiced by you into a wasp's tail needle, which is so sinister and powerful. If it weren't for the people in the back mountain who have the ability to protect themselves, I'm afraid that they would really fall into your trap." Ning Kai sadly said, "Seventh sister, this is not what I want. What can I do if it doesn't listen to me? I can't beat it." His words were really a little cute. Seventh sister covered her sleeves and smiled. Suddenly, her eyes rolled and her fingers slightly flicked. With a slight sound, Ning Kai suddenly felt something extra on his collar. He looked down and saw a cold shining thin needle piercing through his collar and stopping there, only a little bit more to stab into his neck. He raised his head to look at seventh sister in the pavilion in astonishment, thinking that she could still have such accuracy and strength from such a long distance. Her acupuncture skills were really terrifying. Seventh sister stood up and looked at him with a smile. She said, "You idiot. Since you can't control so much chi of heaven and earth, why do you have to learn flying sword? Isn't flying needle the same?" Ning Kai stood at the lakeside in a daze. "The needle is too thin. It is too difficult to use psyche power to control the chi of heaven and earth like silk. The most important thing is that it is a little thing smaller than a flying sword. If I want to feel and control it, I need to have a high degree of precision. I can't just try again. The tip of the wooden sword is polished. Even if the needle is polished, it will still hurt when it stabs someone. If I really stab one of the senior brothers, they will definitely not be like the goose who hit me twice and let it go." In the pine forest at the back of the mountain of the academy, Ning Kai stared at the thin needle between his fingers and muttered to himself. He shuddered when he thought that the big white goose raised by second brother had been stabbed in the butt and chased him for half of the mountain. Rest. I have to rest for a while. He stood up from under the pine tree and walked deeper into the forest. His nose twitched slightly as he smelled the faint smell of oil. He easily found his 2 senior brothers who were deep in conversation under an ancient pine tree. "Senior brother, play chess with me." Fifth brother saw who it was and his face became extremely ugly. He said in shock, "Youngest brother. How did you find us?" Ning Kai answered honestly, "Youngest brother has learned to hunt in Min Mountain since he was a child. It is easy to find a person in the mountain." The 5th senior brother glanced at the guy opposite him, whose face was also ashen, and said in a trembling voice, "8th junior brother, I'm your senior brother. Since I can't escape today, you should take the task of playing chess with this lousy chess player." One day, Ning Kai didn't practice Haran sword. Instead, he obediently helped 6th brother in the iron house. From morning to evening, he didn't know how many times he had waved the iron hammer. Even with his strong body, he still felt sore all over. Sixth brother untied the leather apron in front of his naked body, scooped up a ladle of water and handed it to him. He asked with a smile, "What is it?" "You can say it now." Ning-Kei poured the water into his stomach and let out a comfortable sigh. He said, "Senior brother, seventh sister suggested that I can try flying needles. But they are too light and not easy to control. So I want to ask if you have any solution. Although you are just in a no-doubt state, you should have some ideas about natal items, right?" Sixth brother asked. Ning-Kei said in distress, "It's funny. Now I have a strong reaction to silver, but I can't take silver ingots as natal items." Sixth brother was stunned. After a long silence, he said, "Then I give you some silver needles." Ning-Kei's eyes lit up and said, "Can you make it heavier?" Sixth brother looked at him and said, "It will be gold if it's heavier." Ning-Kei said seriously, "Although I haven't tried gold, I believe that my feeling towards it will definitely surpass my feeling towards silver." Sixth brother was silent again. After a long time, he said helplessly, "Gold needles are too soft. I will find a way to mix something else for you." Ning-Kei was overjoyed and bowed deeply. Then he suddenly thought of a possibility and his eyes became brighter. On the second day of a certain day, in a calligraphy and painting shop on Lin 47th Street in Chang'an City, a black-faced handmaiden threw pots and rags with a sullen face. She was in an extremely bad mood and decided to take out her private money to buy cosmetic powder in Chenjinji Cosmetics store. And her young master, like a bad gambler, grabbed a pile of silver notes and went out. He exchanged them for silver and gold and returned to the back of the mountain of the academy happily. The coarse wrapping cloth was untied, and 3 padeos, which had been polished until they shone with a cold light, appeared in front of the sixth senior brother. Ning-Kei stood beside the 3 padeos and looked at sixth brother with hope in his eyes. Sixth brother looked at the padeos and the gold and silver beside them. After a long silence, he looked up at the excited Ning-Kei and asked seriously, "According to these things, I think youngest brother, you are going to play with flying knives?" "Yes." Ning-Kei rubbed his hands and said nervously, "Senior brother, I'm good at bladesmanship. Since swords can fly, so can knives. And with your help, I believe it will be better than flying swords." Sixth brother's expression finally became stiff. "But, have you ever seen such a big flying knife in the world?" In Ning-Kei's view, the enemy hated him, so their verbal attacks were nothing. Those smart people were best at talking, so their verbal attacks were also nothing. However, sixth brother was a simple and honest good man. His occasional verbal attacks had deeply hurt his self-esteem. Because he was a little depressed and hurt his self-esteem, Ning-Kei decided to calm down and think about what to do in the future. So he went to the mountain road and went straight to the flowering trees. In the deep spring, he found 11th brother who was muttering to himself. "Senior brother, do you have any new ideas recently? Tell me about them." Someone was flying a sword by the lake, smashing the flowers, grass and senior brother's heads, messing up the senior sister's embroidery, messing up the magical lines on the sand table, and messing up the green waves and wet grass in the water. A certain someone was flying needles in the forest, and a few wounds appeared on his body. Not long after, he could be seen being chased by a fat white goose, crying out in pain all over the mountains and plains. Someone was forging iron in the house with all kinds of strange materials at his feet, mainly gold and silver, supplemented by gems. Sixth brother was silently sorting out the design for him, and his simple and honest face was full of grievances. In the late spring of the 14th year of Jianxi era, these scenes kept repeating in the back mountain of the academy. Until many years later, people living in the back mountain still felt a little scared when they thought of those days. That junior brother who had just entered the second floor was practicing his lousy sword and his lousy needles, thinking of his lousy ideas, torturing his senior brothers and sisters, causing them to feel incomparably vexed. "Have you been crazy lately?" Chen Pippi put down the food box and looked at Ning-Kei, who was still satisfied after losing 3 games of chess to 8th brother, and asked with emotion. What do you mean? Trying flying needles or flying knives? Ning Ke asked confusedly. Everything. Chen Pipi said angrily, you haven't even mastered the Haran sword, and you haven't mastered the talisman Taoism from Master Yen Sei. How can you have so much energy to do so many strange things? It's always good to learn more. Why are you so anxious? Cultivation is about gradual progress, and the most important thing is to lay a good foundation. My aptitude is so poor that it's useless to lay a good foundation. It's better to learn more. Chen Pipi sighed and said, in my opinion, you'd better focus on talisman Taoism. Talisman Taoism is about comprehension and talent, not the foundation. Ning Ke asked curiously, why can't we learn together? Chen Pipi frowned and said, greed is not a good thing for cultivation. Ning Ke said with a smile, I have learned a truth since I was a child. Nothing can be achieved without greed. Chen Pipi was so angry that he laughed and said, I just found out that you are such a stupid person, even more stupid than second brother. I won't tell second brother this. A bowl of crab porridge. That's impossible. Our family has been losing money too fast recently, and Sang Sang is already very unhappy. Then, how much do you want? 200 taels of silver. 200 taels of silver. Why do you need so many silver needles? Do you want to learn medicine and acupuncture? It's none of your business. Fine, fine, fine. Then I'll scold you more for being an idiot. Pipi, don't forget that the back of the mountain is the 2nd floor of the academy. We are all on the 2nd floor, so we are all idiots. Idiot Chen, do you have a problem with that? I have no problem with that. Chen Pipi looked at him as if he was looking at a madman, and gritted his teeth and said, even if you do that for cultivation, why do you harass senior brothers every day? In the beginning, didn't you turn pale when you heard that you were going to listen to music and play chess? Why did you suddenly change your temper and go to listen to music and play chess every day? Ning Ke answered with a smile, I didn't like it at first because I didn't like to be forced to listen to music and play chess. Now that second brother has said that no one will force me, I can still do it if I want to. Senior brother Baigong's flute is really good. Where can I find a chance to play chess with the 2 national masters outside the academy? Doing some extracurricular activities as entertainment during cultivation can cultivate one's character. In the future, when I travel around the world, these things can be used to brag and shock people. Chen Pipi was dumbfounded. He held his chubby cheeks and asked, what about 11th brother? Why are you bothering him? 11th brother doesn't think I'm bothering him. Ning Ke approached him and said in a low voice, have you found that listening to 11th brother's mysterious questions can not only help you fall asleep, but also help you meditate? That night, all the disciples of the 2nd floor of the academy held a group meeting at the back of the mountain. Even the scholar in the small library in the cliff cave was called over. However, the old man was reading an old book and did not pay attention to what the people around him were saying. Ning Ke did not attend the meeting, not because he had returned home in Chang'an, but because the main topic of the meeting was to discuss how to deal with his current problem. Don't you think youngest brother is miserable? Haran's sword has become a wasp-tail needle. This is definitely not his wish, but his aptitude is like this, so he is forced to think of these messy ideas. I say you should be more tolerant. Although he smiles every day, I always feel that there are tears in his smile, and there is a shadow in his heart. The meeting was held in the courtyard where second brother lived. 7th sister held an embroidery frame and sat cross-legged in the deepest part of the arhat bed. Her posture was very casual and natural, and it could be seen that she was not afraid of second brother. Hearing this, 4th brother, who had the most serious expression, frowned and said, it's not a matter of tolerance. Will I really be angry with youngest brother? Now the main problem is how to help youngest brother solve his cultivation problems. 3rd sister, Yu Lian, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, smiled slightly, but did not say anything. Fifth brother frowned and said, I think the first problem is to help youngest brother enhance his confidence. He now pesters me and eighth brother to play chess every day, and he still smiles no matter how badly he loses. It is obvious that he has lost and even become a little abnormal. This is not good. Everyone thought that it was indeed reasonable. Ninth brother gently knocked on his flute, and after a moment of silence, he looked somewhere and said, Teacher and eldest brother are not here, and now second brother is the senior in the back mountain. To be honest, second brother's words on the day when we practiced swordsmanship by the lake were really hurtful. As the saying goes, if second brother sincerely praises youngest brother, I think you can restore his confidence in cultivating Haran sword. Everyone looked at second senior brother, who was sitting in the middle. After a long silence, second brother said, I will not lie. This will be the most lovely and loving chapter since I opened the book at night. The more I write, the more I like the academy, and I will like it until the end of this story. Starting from 6,000 tomorrow, I will start to supercharge myself. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chijien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Seventh sister grabbed a handful of melon seeds from the windowsill and lowered her head to pick the plumpest melon kernels. She said with slight mockery, 11th brother, if I learn these useless things from you, what if youngest brother starves to death in the future? 11th brother looked at her and explained seriously, little senior sister, my family is very rich in the south. In the future, I will inherit a large amount of family property. Even if little junior brother is a waste, I can support him for a lifetime. At this point in time, the topic of the meeting to help Ning Kei's youngest brother had gradually deviated to an unknown direction. Everyone in the room was talking at once, giving advice, discussing enthusiastically and debating fiercely. They were deeply concerned about Ning Kei's future livelihood and expressed that they could be responsible for Ning Kei's life. Even they were touched by their friendship as fellow disciples. Senior brothers and senior sisters, don't you think too much? Chen Pippi looked at the people in the room who were eating melon seeds, drinking tea and having a tea party. He rubbed the back of his head and said bitterly, I know better than you what kind of person Ning Kei is. Although he is an idiot in cultivation, he is not a real idiot. Don't tell me you haven't done anything. Ever since he entered the back mountain, all of us have been circling around him. Someone like him doesn't need us to worry about him. I dare say that even if all the people in the world died, including us in the room, he would not die, let alone starve to death. Hearing this, the people on the second floor of the academy were stunned. Thinking of the experience these days, their expressions became very interesting. Beigong Weiyang gently stroked his flute and said with a frown, that's true. When younger brother wants to listen to music, he goes into the woods and plays for us. When he doesn't want to listen, he resolutely refuses to listen. Why do I feel that I have become a singer in front of him? Fifth brother patted his thigh and shook his head, saying with emotion, he said he would play chess. Obviously, eighth brother and I just entered the middle game, but he dared to interfere and forced us to hold back our temper to guide him. Otherwise, he would really dare to throw away the chess pieces. In front of younger brother, we are just two village chess teachers who are not up to standard. Sixth brother looked at the thoughtful people and said with a simple and honest smile, Ning Kei treats me well. Although he often has some inexplicable ideas, he often helps me to forge iron and carry water, which saves me a lot of trouble. Second brother looked at the younger brothers who were complaining about their bloody and tearful history and slightly raised his eyebrows, saying, Ning Kei is the youngest younger brother. As his senior brothers, it is natural for you to take care of him. What's there to say about these things? Listening to second brother's admonition and looking at his serious expression, everyone in the room was shocked at the same time. They all bowed their heads and agreed. Even seventh sister, who had been very casual before, also put the melon seeds back on the windowsill. Although I despise Yen Sei's attitude of playing with the world, I have to admit that as the Minister of Offerings of the South School of Haotian, he is indeed the world's top class and even the most powerful divine talisman master. He is more powerful than people think. Second brother slightly lowered his eyes and looked at something in front of him. After a moment of silence, he continued to say in a low voice, since younger brother is so talented and only suitable for the way of talisman Taoism, let him learn more from Yen Sei in the future. It was quiet in the room. Seventh sister raised her head and slightly frowned, saying, but younger brother is after all a member of the second floor of the academy. Now he can be regarded as the teacher's last disciple. But his cultivation is all taught by an outsider. How can it be spread out? Even if we are not afraid of the gossip of the world, will the teacher and eldest brother be disappointed with us when they come back? It was unknown whether the headmaster of the academy would be deeply disappointed when he returned to the academy with his eldest disciple after traveling and found that he had inexplicably gained a last disciple who was only in the no-doubt state and had an extremely poor cultivation aptitude. Moreover, the only ability this disciple could show was the means of talisman Taoism learned from Haotian Taoism. Anyway, Ning Ke was not disappointed. Although the Haoran sword was still like the snow covering the dog shit, he had adjusted his mentality very well. Besides studying in the back of the mountain of the academy these days, he would travel around Chang and with Master Yen Sei every few days. He approached the Tao of talisman Taoism in a relaxed and interesting way and lived a very fulfilling life. In those days at the end of spring and the beginning of summer in the 14th year of Tianqi era, the residents of Chang and could often see an extremely dirty old Taoist wandering around with a simple but extremely clean lad. The old Taoist took the lad through the streets and alleys to see the old and dilapidated buildings that had been inherited for hundreds of years. They went to various taverns to drink and occasionally spent the night in the cheapest brothel. Most of the time, they went to see the scenery that tourists must go to. When walking through the newly renovated block of Spring Breeze Pavilion, Yen Sei was full of emotion and said, although it is new, the original meaning has been lost. Fortunately, there is still this pavilion. Don't you think the curve of the pavilion's eaves is beautiful? Ning Ke walked in the streets where he once fought for a night and looked at the old Spring Breeze Pavilion at the corner of the street absent-mindedly. He woke up after hearing his master's words and carefully looked at the 4 slightly protruding lines above the pavilion's eaves. After a long time, he doubtfully asked, I can't tell what's beautiful about it. I just think it looks very harmonious. The place where the black tiles meet is slightly sunken and then raised, very smooth. That is the rain line. Master Yen Sei pointed at the eaves line and said, the rain falls on the black tiles and flows down along the overlapping place of the tiles. It doesn't pass through the rain line, but the shape of the rain line implies the falling rain is slippery, so you will feel it is smooth. Master, what does the rain line on the pavilion's eaves mean? Ning Ke asked, this pavilion should have been built many years ago. Those craftsmen can't be talisman masters. Can they also understand the law of the Qi of heaven and earth? What is the law? The law is a fixed rule of the operation of things. Those craftsmen who built Spring Breeze Pavilion may not have mastered the law of the operation of the Qi of heaven and earth, but the knowledge of building eaves has been passed down for countless generations, so there is indeed some hidden wisdom in it. Master Yen Sei took him to the pavilion and said, how does the rain walk? Why does it walk like this? The craftsmen who built the pavilion don't know. Maybe their grandmaster only knows the answer to the first question, but not the second question. But it doesn't matter. The first step for human beings to learn from the heaven and earth is always imitation. If you imitate more, you will naturally practice the simplest truth, which is the undulating shape of the line, just like this eaves. Walking to the Spring Breeze Pavilion, Master Yen Sei turned around and looked at Ning Ke, saying, the first step to practice talisman Taoism is imitation. I let you read the talisman classics left by the predecessors and carefully feel the subtle difference between the Qi of heaven and earth, which is very similar to the building experience accumulated by the craftsmen for many years. However, they do it subconsciously and it takes several generations of time. But you have to take the initiative to grasp and feel it, and the less time, the better. After seeing Spring Breeze Pavilion, the master and the apprentice left the street and walked along the grey wall beside the courtyard to the distance. Stepping on the slightly protruding bluestone path and looking at the gurgling water not far from his feet, Ning Ke naturally remembered that rainy night. This ditch had been stained with blood, and these bluestone paths were full of mutilated corpses. Behind the grey wall was Chao Xiaoshu's mansion. Ning Ke looked up and saw the green trees in the courtyard. Occasionally, he could hear people's voices. He wondered if Chao Xiaoshu's family still lived here, and where had he gone? Seeming to guess what he was thinking, Master Yen Sei, who was walking in front with his sleeves behind his back, asked with a smile. Chao Xiaoshu entered the knowing destiny state by looking at the calm lake. This kind of understanding and lucky chance is really rare. Even with Chao Xiaoshu's talent, if he had not been forced by His Majesty to stay in the dark mud of Chang and for many years, I think it would be impossible for him to burst out such a brilliant brilliance. This was the first time for Ning Ke to know that Chao Xiaoshu was a grand cultivator in the knowing destiny state. Thinking of the bloody scene behind the middle-aged man on that rainy night, he could not help but raise his eyebrows slowly, and there was an indescribable sense of pride and grandeur in his heart. You should have seen Chao Xiaoshu's swordsmanship. Yes, master. What do you think is special? Very fast, like lightning. Ning Ke thought of the crooked wooden sword flying by the lake in the back mountain of the academy and felt very ashamed. Master Yen Sei looked at him with a smile and said, "Is there anything else?" Ning Ke thought of one thing, but he licked his lips and did not say it. Because although Yen Sei was his master in talisman Taoism, that thing was very likely to be Chao Xiaoshu's trump card to save his life. This kind of thing should not be said to anyone. I didn't know that you are a person who values friendship and righteousness. Master Yen Sei looked at him with some surprise. Ning Ke smiled and replied, Brother Chao treated me well. After I left Chang'an, he was still concerned about my livelihood and left me a large sum of silver every month. Even if he didn't care much for me, the silver would still weigh a lot. Yen Sei laughed and said, Chao Xiaoshu divided one sword into 5. I know this thing without you telling me. I just want to tell you that when the 5 pieces of sword shrouded the streets around him like shooting stars, have you ever thought that if it was his natal sword, why could it still be so obedient to him after it was divided into 5 pieces? Ning Ke really didn't think about this problem. After the bloody battle last spring, he didn't think about it because he didn't know what cultivation was at that time. The reason why he didn't think about it later was that he didn't think about it at all. At this time, when he was walking away from Spring Breeze Pavilion to the street, he suddenly heard his master's question and suddenly fell into meditation. Master Yen Sei was not a teacher who liked to embarrass his students with all kinds of questions so as to gain a great sense of scholarly superiority, vanity and sadistic pleasure. Glancing at Ning Ke who was frowning and thinking hard, Master Yen Sei directly explained, Chao Xiaoshu's natal sword is divided into 5 small swords. The interaction between these 5 small swords depends on a kind of tactical array. And I have told you before that all tactical arrays can actually be regarded as a kind of transforming talisman, a big talisman that relies more on materials. Then he continued, Taoism's sword skills are talismans, Buddhism's emblematic gestures are also talismans, and these 2 kinds of talismans are infinitive. As for the decorations on the general's 100 battles armor, although most of them are fragments, they are also talismans, but this kind of talisman is infinitive. Ning Ke glanced at him and couldn't help but say with a wry smile, Master, I know you are the most powerful divine talisman master in the world, and I know every talisman master should have the deepest and most sincere feelings and love for talisman Taoism, but, if what you said is true, does it mean that all the cultivation methods in the world can finally be attributed to talismans? This kind of statement is really, too much, isn't it? Master Yen Sei stopped and turned back to ask confusedly, too much? Too much. After hesitating for a moment, Ning Ke lowered his voice and said, too narcissistic. Master Yen Sei laughed out loud, which attracted the attention of passers-by in the street. His laughter gradually stopped, and he looked at Ning Ke for a moment and seriously said, "The most important thing in cultivation is to have the mind, to dare to think and to dare to admit. The long road is long. If you don't believe that you can go to the end, how can you cross those difficult and strange dangerous peaks on the road of cultivation? The more excellent a cultivator is, the more confident he will be, and the most excellent cultivators must be extremely arrogant, which is probably what you call narcissism." Ning Ke slightly opened his mouth and couldn't say a word for a long time. He wanted to criticize what his master said was a fallacy, but after careful consideration, he felt that these words were very reasonable, especially when he thought of the two extremely narcissistic and proud guys, second brother of the academy and Chen Pippi. After leaving Spring Breeze Pavilion, they came to an open avenue from the eastern city through Shanmo Square. Not far away, the Yulin Royal Guards were patrolling on horses. There were fewer pedestrians on the street, and the environment was quiet and secluded along the banks of green trees and clear rivers. The towering imperial city not far away was clearly visible to the naked eye, and even some traces on the vermilion wall washed by the wind and rain could be seen. Master Yen Sei was not affected by the solemn atmosphere here at all. He still carried his sleeves and wore his old shoes, strolling slowly on the street, and didn't care about the vigilant and disgusted eyes of those Yulin royal guards. Ning Ke tried to hold back his laughter and followed him. Suddenly he remembered the part about carving talismans on armors in the previous conversation, and some introductions by Liu Qingchen on the journey last year. His eyes suddenly brightened, and he hurried to Master Yen Sei and said in a very respectful and gentle tone, "Master, I want to ask you for a talisman." Yen Sei turned back and asked, "Ask for a talisman? What happened to your family? Did you see something unclean, and was pressed on the bed?" Ning Ke opened his mouth and didn't know how to answer, feeling very powerless. Master Yen Sei squinted his triangular eyes wretchedly and said, "Just kidding." Ning Ke sighed and said seriously, "I want to carve a talisman on my knife." After thinking for a moment, Master Yen Sei shook his head and said, "Some talismans can indeed be used without a talisman master, such as sending messages, armors, and weapons. This kind of carving talismans is not rare, but after all, it is not pure enough, and its power is not too great. As the saying goes, your own talisman is the best. If it is your personal weapon, you'd better keep it in the future." Ning Ke said with a bitter smile, "Then I don't know when I can get what I want." Master Yen Sei patted him on the shoulder and comforted him, "I firmly believe in your talent in talisman Taoism. Now you just haven't seen through the window paper yet. Slowly feel it, and you will find that there is always hope in front of you. Look over there carefully." "What's over there?" "Look by yourself." "Master, I only see a lot of trees." "What about behind the trees?" "Behind the trees is the sky. What I want you to see is not these things." "Master, you don't want me to say that I see hope, do you?" "I really can't say such sour words." "Master, why don't you speak? In fact, in my opinion, it is really not suitable for you to play the role of a spiritual mentor, since you have such a temperament of seeing beauties as white bones in the world." Ning Quebec, "Yes, Master. If you go on, I will use the grass talisman to make you unable to see things for the rest of your life." There was no hope in front of the master and disciple. They could only see a Taoist temple in the green forest at the foot of the imperial city. Master Yen Sei did not take Ning Ke into the Southern Gate Temple, because they were private master and disciple. After all, Ning Ke was a student of the academy, and it was very inappropriate for him to be too close to Haotian Taoism. "What I want you to see is the cornice of the sightseeing hall of the Southern Gate." Because of the previous conversation, Master Yen Sei's face was very ugly, and his tone was very stiff. Ning Ke looked up and saw the cornice of the main hall of the Taoist temple in the blue sky behind the grey walls and green trees. "Master, why do you want to see this cornice? Do you want to understand the law that the craftsmen of the past subconsciously summed up from the power of rain? It is enough to see the Spring Breeze Pavilion. Do you want to see it forever? We have seen a lot of old temples, old pavilions, small bridges, flowing water, and houses in Chang'an City these days. If we continue to see it, I am afraid that the Chang'an local government will suspect that we are two thieves. Grass talisman, Master, I was wrong. Master Yen Sei suppressed his anger after a while, pointed to the cornice deep in the Taoist temple, and said with a livid face, "This time I don't want you to see the cornice, but the animals on the eaves squatting on the cornice. You release your psyche power to feel it and see what is there." Ning Kai suddenly became serious. After a moment of silence, he slowly released his psyche power and touched the stone beasts on eaves that were half squatting on the eaves. The existence of the beasts on eaves was fed back into the sense of perception woven by psyche power through the chi of heaven and earth. However, the next moment, the beasts on eaves seemed to be alive, and he could even see their eyes. His heartbeat began to accelerate gradually, and his breathing became heavier and heavier. Those animals on the eaves in the sense of perception and sight became more and more clear, and the coercion from them became heavier and heavier, which directly made his face pale and his body extremely stiff. Master Yen Sei stood beside him and didn't worry about his reaction. Instead, he was calm and slightly happy. Ning Kai was so sensitive to the reaction of the animals on the eaves, which slightly diluted his anger after being ridiculed before. Ning Kai shook his head and got rid of the previous state. He raised his hands to rub his eyes, looked at Master Yen Sei and said, "Master, I feel it, and I understand." Master Yen Sei slightly frowned, and it seemed that he didn't expect that Ning Kai could actually get rid of the coercion from the animals on the eaves. Ning Kai glanced at the animals on the eaves in the distance, which became smaller again, and said, "Master, do you want to tell me that these stone animals on the eaves are also talismans, which are endowed by the divine talisman master with power and coercion that is close to a powerful life?" Master Yen Sei said, "Yes. What I am more confused about is why you didn't panic when you touched the animals on the eaves for the first time." Ning Kai looked at him, and after a moment of silence, he honestly replied, "I have touched the animals on the eaves before." Master Yen Sei slightly raised his white eyebrows and asked, "When? Where?" Ning Kai said, "Last spring, in the palace. When the carriage passed by the laundry office, I don't know why, when I saw the animals on the eaves of the palace, I suddenly felt that they were alive, and I felt very uncomfortable at that time." Master Yen Sei was silent for a long time, and suddenly reached out to touch his head, and his eyes were full of gentle appreciation. He subconsciously put his hands into the cuffs, clenched them very tightly, and felt that his body was a little stiff. The vermilion bird painting was as solemn and beautiful as usual. Its wings had not fully spread out, and it was just the time when it was about to flap. The two eyes that were not angry but majestic were so well carved that no matter from which angle you looked, you would feel that it was staring at you. This was a must-see scenic spot for people from all counties of the Tang Empire when they came to Chang'an City, and the two eyes of the vermilion bird painting were also the wonderful thing that all the tourists talked about. Standing in the crowd with different clothes and looking at the vermilion bird painting in the middle, Ning Kai's vigilance and fear in his heart faded a little, perhaps because of the noisy environment and the lively people around him. However, his body was still stiff, and his hands and feet were still cold, because he always felt that the eyes that had been staring at him had nothing to do with the skills of the carvers. The eyes seemed to be telling him that the vermilion bird which had experienced thousands of years of wind and rain, was alive. "I have two pieces of news to report to you. First, because I went crazy again and ate too much, I still have a chapter of 3,000 words later, so I will continue to write it. Second, my friend Sharp Knife has started a new book called Transformation of God of War. You can click on the direct train below and directly go there. Please support me." The advertising slogan is as follows: "This is a huge, beautiful, and mysterious world of Do Chi, where countless powerhouses are hidden. On the road of martial arts, you fight with the sky, the earth, and people. Never surrender, never retreat. If the road in front of you is blocked, then use your fists to punch a way out. As long as you have the heart of a powerhouse, no matter what is in front of you, you will directly smash it with one punch. Transformation of God of War, Blood Boiling. Chapter 179. Seeing the vermilion bird again, do you have any new feelings? No, right? Don't you think it's alive? Master, do you also think so? At this time, the master and the disciple had walked out of the crowd and continued to the south along the Vermilion Bird Avenue. Hearing Master Yen Sei's words, Ning Ke asked in surprise, and then he could not help but look back at the vermilion bird painting that was surrounded by the crowd and could no longer be seen. Master Yen Sei ignored him and continued to walk forward. What kind of existence can be sure to be alive and has life? Ning Ke turned to catch up with him, thinking that when 11th brother asked this kind of question, he was sleeping most of the time. Of course, this is a difficult question, and it has little to do with the reason why I take you to see the vermilion bird painting today. Master Yen Sei said, I take you here to tell you that the painting on the Vermilion Bird Avenue has nothing to do with artistic sculpture. It is a divine talisman in Changpan. Ning Ke was slightly startled. He really did not associate the vermilion bird painting with talisman Taoism, because he could faintly feel that the vermilion bird painting possessed a kind of terrifying power. The killing intent that seemed to come from ancient times and the existence of talisman, which felt wonderful but faint, seemed to be from two different worlds. You have said before that we talisman masters regard all the cultivation methods in the world as talismans. It is a very narcissistic mentality. But I can tell you with certainty that the vermilion bird painting is a talisman, a divine talisman left by the previous sage. The words of sage and divine talisman came into Ning Ke's mind. He frowned tightly and asked after a long silence, Master, you once said that divine talisman masters can move the world with talismans only after they have crossed that step. Has the previous sage who left the vermilion bird painting already crossed that step? 1,000 years ago, the empire set the capital of Chang'an and expanded on the basis of the original city. At that time, the vermilion bird divine talisman had already existed. When the previous sage drew the vermilion bird divine talisman, he must have surpassed the knowing destiny state, but I don't know whether it was Tianqi or limitless state. But the talisman that I told you last time, I guess, it needs a more profound state. Does it mean that he has become an immortal? Is there such a great cultivator in the world? When Haotian Taoism is cultivated to the end, beyond Tianqi is immortalization. The so-called immortalization is immortal ascension. Although I have never seen it with my own eyes, there are many seniors who have immortalization and immortal ascension in the Taoist classics. A legend is just a legend. Ning Ke was surprised and wondered why his master took him up the city wall, but he was too lazy to get to the bottom of it. He just stared at the dirty Taoist robe and climbed up. However, he was still a little confused about the power of the vermilion bird talisman, so he could not help but ask, Master, how powerful is the knowing destiny state? I have asked someone to perform once, but I have never seen a fight at the knowing destiny state. Master Yen Sei frowned and asked, which silly grand cultivator would be so idiotic to perform for you? Ning Ke secretly thought that the grand cultivator was named Chen Pipi. Although he was an idiot in life, he was really a good person. Master Yen Sei unhappily scolded, as for the fight at the knowing destiny state. Do you want me to find Lu Bai and have a fight with him again? Ning Ke explained with a bitter face, you misunderstood me. I am just curious. The master and the disciple climbed up the high city wall. The wind from the plain climbed up along the old but still strong city wall, with a few sharp cries of eagles, and their clothes were fluttering. Master Yen Sei stood on the edge of the city wall, stroking the black bricks and looking at the clearly visible mountain in the south. He suddenly said, your second brother in the academy only needs to look at you, and you will die. This is the knowing destiny state. Ning Ke stood beside him and thought silently, looking at the mountain where he had lived and studied for more than a month. Look at you, and you will die. Ning Ke carefully pondered these words and felt more and more respectful and timid. After a moment of silence, he honestly replied. Master, I understand. I will definitely be more respectful to you and second brother in the future. Master Yen Sei took him to the other side of the city wall facing Chang'an. Chang'an, which was composed of countless market buildings, had now become a jigsaw puzzle under their feet. The imperial palace in the north of the city did not look so unattainable. If the Vermilion Bird Avenue below was a sharp and straight sword, then the imperial palace was the hilt. What do you see? These days, Master Yen Sei took Ning Kei to travel around Chang'an and saw many historical sites. Every time they arrived at a place, he would ask questions. Ning Kei knew that the old man wanted to use this method to speed up his understanding of talisman Taoism. In fact, whether it was the eaves of Spring Breeze Pavilion or the animal carvings on the eaves, he could really deepen his understanding of talisman Taoism. However, at this time, standing on the city wall and watching the scenery of the city, the whole Chang'an appeared in front of him. Without the bustling appearance, there was only silence and the sense of separation after the line of sight was pulled away. Ordinary people would probably scream excitedly to find where their home was. From the perspective of literature and art, they could probably perceive the historical vicissitudes of this magnificent city left by thousands of years. But from the perspective of talisman Taoism, what could they see? Chang'an City is actually a big tactical array. Master Yen Sei's answer directly shocked Ning Kei and made him speechless. This is a magnificent city that gathered the wisdom of countless cultivators of previous generations. Even with the wealth of the Tang Empire, it took us 30 years to build it. It is only natural that it should be the most powerful tactical matrix in the world. That's why it is called Shocking God. Ning Kei opened his eyes and looked at Chang'an City under his feet, trying hard to see the general appearance of the tactical array, but to no avail. Master Yen Sei looked at his expression and could not help smiling, saying, "The God-shocking tactical array of Chang'an City can't be seen with the naked eye, and most of it is buried underground. I can tell you that the array pivot is under the Imperial Palace, and the Vermilion Bird Avenue is the array route." The old Taoist pointed to the direction of the Imperial Palace with his right hand, and then his fingertips slowly moved down along the Vermilion Bird Avenue, and continued, "The array route extends to our feet, that is, the south gate of Vermilion Bird. Then it disperses through the city wall, and returns to all the city holes in the inner and outer city. You can also see the big tactical array of Chang'an City as an extremely complicated and vast talisman. This talisman is composed of countless divine talismans. As long as the array eye is opened, this vast talisman will be activated to protect this magnificent city and its residents." Ning Kei looked at the dense buildings in Chang'an City, looked at the busy but joyful people like ants, and listened to Master Yen Sei's words. He could not help but be shocked, and his admiration and awe were beyond words. "The Vermilion Bird painting that I took you to see just now is the most powerful divine talisman in this vast talisman." It took Ning Kei a long time to suppress the shock in his heart. Looking at the magnificent city in front of him, he murmured with emotion, "Once this big tactical array is opened, I don't know what it will be like. Will the dark clouds cover the sky, or will the earth shake, and the city stay still? No one knows what the picture will be like. I believe that even the designer and the former cultivators responsible for building the tactical array don't know, and they won't want to know, and I don't want to know either." Master Yen Sei looked at him seriously and said, "The activation of the God-stunning tactical array means that Chang'an City is about to be breached. If that day comes, it can only mean that our Tang Empire is on the verge of destruction." Ning Kei suddenly thought of a key problem, and looked at Master Yen Sei seriously and said, "Master, you shouldn't tell me such things, especially the array pivot and the array route. It's not good." Master Yen Sei calmly said, "Do you know who is responsible for the God-stunning tactical array of Chang'an City in the Tang Empire now?" "Who?" "Your master, me." Master Yen Sei looked at him with a smile and said, "And you are my only successor." After I leave this world, you will be responsible for the god-stunning tactical array. So it's natural to let you know some things in advance. Ning Ke did not say anything. With a pale face, he turned to look at Chang and city below the city tower and shook his head. A very strange sound came out of his mouth. It seemed that he was swearing, and it was more like he was unconsciously muttering. After a long time, he looked back at Master Yen Sei and said bitterly, "Master, don't be so scary." Chapter 180. If I scare you to death, where can I find a successor? The problem is that it doesn't sound true. Why not? Chang and city, god-stunning array, to me. Why? Why? Because there are too few divine talisman masters qualified to preside over the god-stunning array, and even fewer who can be absolutely trusted by the empire. Among the 3 divine talisman masters living in seclusion in the academy, only little Huang He is a citizen of Tang, and your uncle Gongsun has a serious health problem. Ning Ke, you are a student of the headmaster of academy and my disciple. Why can't the imperial court trust you? Why can't it be given to you? Who can agree? I agree. Master, is it enough for you to agree? His Majesty has agreed. He told me that he once told you that he would take you to see something after you officially step into talisman Taoism. His Majesty did say that, but, what does it have to do with what we are talking about now? When you see that thing in the future, you will understand. It was certainly a very happy and glorious thing to be a noble divine talisman master. However, if the safety of the whole Chang and city or even the whole Tang Empire was in your hands after becoming a divine talisman master, then this happiness and glory would be countless times stronger. However, the strengthening of glory would eventually turn into a mountain-like responsibility and a sky-like pressure. Thinking that decades later, when he stood on the tower in Chang and looked down at the world, he would no longer be able to feel relaxed and carefree. Instead, he would have to carefully observe the millions of Tang people living among them and be ready to make choices that ordinary people would never be able to make for the survival of the Tang Empire, which had lasted for thousands of years. Ning Ke felt that it was difficult for him to breathe and he felt depressed. If an objective evaluation was made, any young man who had just touched the cultivation world for less than a year and was still in the no-doubt state would be scared to death when he suddenly learned that the big shots of the empire were so important to him in the future. Ning Ke was no exception. After all, he had experienced too many shocks in his life, and he was bold enough to be wild enough. Especially after entering the second floor of the academy, his mind became more stable, even calm and lazy. So after returning to Lin 47th Street, his mood quickly returned to normal. At the entrance of the alley, an old cat was lying on the flagstone, squinting and lazily basking in the sun. In fact, Ning Ke was not lazy. In the following days, in order to avoid the enthusiastic Chang and citizens and stewards, he still got up before dark and went out early in the morning. He went to the back of the mountain of the academy to practice his swordsmanship, knife, and fine needles. He also listened to the wind, music, and chess. After leaving the academy, he continued to tour the scenery around Chang'an and visited various Taoist temples and ancient temples. However, he did not have his master to accompany him and was alone on the road. Chang'an city finally came to the most difficult period of the year, the hot and stuffy summer. Ning Ke had also visited more than a dozen Taoist temples and finally arrived at the Wanyan Tower in southern city. Unfortunately, spring had passed and the flock of geese had already gone north to Xuanyang Lake in Gushan Commandery to spend the summer. Therefore, he did not have the chance to see the stunning scene of tens of thousands of geese flying around the ancient tower. However, places like Taoist and Buddhist temples always like to steal the most beautiful scenery of the world as the background. Therefore, the Taoists and monks had no choice but to make some good scenery to avoid being criticized by the world. Therefore, although there were no geese to see in the Wanyan Tower, at least there was a Buddhist pagoda with moss marks on its ancient bricks and the exquisitely carved stone statues of venerables in the Buddha Hall. Ning Ke looked up at the Buddhist pagoda for a while and found that he did not understand anything about talisman Taoism, nor did he see any beauty. He shrugged and walked into the Buddha hall. Suddenly, he was attracted by the smooth lines of the statues of venerables, which were extraordinarily solemn. The world was shrouded by Haotian's divine light. The Buddhism sect silently guarded in a corner of Yueluan kingdom. Although some temples were built around various cities, they were not mainstream. Most of the monks of the Buddhism sect cultivated in the wilderness and had little influence on the secular people. Like most people, Ning Ke did not know much about the doctrines and scriptures of the Buddhism sect. He only knew that the status of the so-called venerables in the Buddhism sect was roughly equivalent to that of the saints that ordinary people talked about. Those were ancient myths and legends. The stone statues of venerables were placed in order in the quiet Buddha hall. The windows were covered with yellow paper. The filtered light fell on the stone statues, emitting a kind of tranquil yellowish luster. The stone statues of venerables were in different shapes. Some were smiling, some were silent, and some looked bitter. The hands that were exposed outside the monks' robes were also different. Some put their palms together, some clenched lightly, and some put their fingers together in a strange way. Ning Ke guessed that this should be the emblematic gesture of the Buddhism sect. He subconsciously imitated the statue according to the statue of the venerables. He stretched his hands out of the sleeves and slowly put his palms together. Then he spread his fingers and crossed them, or bent his fingers and lowered his wrists like a lotus. Gradually, he felt something in his heart, but he could not tell what it was. Walking out of the Buddha hall, the world was shrouded in bright and hot sunlight again. He blinked his eyes and shook his head in disappointment. When he was about to leave, a middle-aged monk walked out of the Wanyan Tower and smiled at him. In the shack on the top of the tower, the middle-aged monk put a cup of tea in front of Ning Ke and said calmly, "You can call me Huang Yang." Ning Ke took the tea and thanked him. He felt that the name was somewhat familiar. It seemed that he had heard Master Yen Sei mention it. "You must have some doubts as to why I invited you upstairs for a chat." The middle-aged monk looked at him and said with a smile, "I was invited by someone to say a few words to you." Ning Ke held the tepid tea and felt a little puzzled. "Who invited you? What do you want to say to me?" At this moment, he finally remembered the identity of this monk Huang Yang. Thinking of the rumors and stories he had heard in the past, he was suddenly shocked. He quickly stood up and bowed to the ground, saying, "Greetings, greetings, master." Huang Yang monk laughed and said, "Many people find it a little troublesome to call me. In the eyes of the common people, I am the so-called younger brother of the emperor, and many times they call me Lord Younger Brother of the Emperor. But I am not a lord, I am just a monk." Ning Ke smiled and didn't know how to answer. Monk Huang Yang pointed at the mountain-like Buddhist scriptures on the desk behind him and said, "These are the true scriptures of the Buddhism sect that I took back from the wilderness. I want to translate them into plain words so that the true meaning of the scriptures can be heard by the world. However, I've spent so many years and there are still many volumes that I haven't finished. So please don't mind me telling you directly." The middle-aged monk sitting opposite was the younger brother of the emperor of the Tang Empire, the most respected sublime being of the Buddhism sect in the empire. Up to now, Ning Ke had not guessed who invited him to talk to him. However, such a sublime being put aside so many Buddhist scriptures and specially took time to talk to him. Presumably, the content of the sublime being must be very important, so Ning Ke would not have the slightest objection. "I don't know much about the Tao of Runes, so I can only talk about the cultivation process that I have experienced. The Buddhism sect pays particular attention to enlightenment. Those who can hold the Buddha's heart are Buddhas. In our view, the surrounding chi of heaven and earth can be said to be a gift from Haotian or some kind of glory that has existed since ancient times. Whether Haotian has the same will as human beings or not, there has always been a debate whether Haotian has the same will as human beings, whether it is the Taoism sect, the Buddhism sect, or the predecessors of the Academy. During the 7 years, I followed 17 different caravans into the wilderness. Some caravans stayed in the barbarian tribes and never came back. More caravans returned to the Yueluan kingdom with generous rewards, but I never found the legendary Holy Land of the Buddhism sect. One of the caravans entered the wilderness 4 times, and I followed them in and out 4 times. I was familiar with the merchants' coachmen and guards. One day, a sandstorm came, and the caravan was trapped in an earthen enclosure somewhere in Chiu City. At night, a team of horse gang, who came to avoid the sandstorm, also entered this earthen enclosure, and then there was no reason to kill them. Hearing the word horse gang, Ning Ke raised his eyebrows subconsciously, and a bright light appeared in his eyes. His body instinctively stiffened, and he was full of killing intent. He asked in a low voice, "Master, what happened later?" He knew that this question was unnecessary. He knew better than anyone else the cruelty of the horse gang in the wilderness, and the master was still sitting here, safe and sound. Something must have happened, and even the master was very likely to be enlightened that day. As expected, Huang Yang monk said, the horse gang was a little afraid of the disciples of the Buddhism sect. They didn't besiege me until they killed all the people. It was at that moment that I, who had followed my master for 20 years and been in and out of the wilderness for 7 years, was finally enlightened. Listening to the master's narration, Ning Ke seemed to be able to see the cruel scene of that night in the wilderness, and his mind was slightly shaken. He looked at the other side of the table and asked subconsciously, "Master, what happened after you were enlightened? What happened to those horse gang later?" Huang Yang monk smiled slightly and didn't answer the question. He just slowly poured some tea into his cup. Ning Ke smiled, knowing that he had asked another meaningless question. Although the Buddhism sect paid particular attention to mercy and enlightenment, he knew that the Buddhism sect also had a thunderous rage when encountering evildoers from the introduction of the furious eyes venerable in the Buddhism sect. Naturally, those horse gang were all killed. Huang Yang monk said, "As for how I was enlightened at that time, I still don't understand until now. I only remember that my body was soaked with the blood of my familiar companions. I felt that the blood was very hot, and my skin was burning, as if it was about to be burned." Hearing this, Ning Ke gently rubbed his fingers under the table, feeling that the blood left in his childhood was still so sticky. Although it had faded a lot now, it still made him feel a little uncomfortable. Huang Yang monk looked at him and said, "For many years, I have been suffering and confused. Since I wanted to be enlightened, why couldn't I be enlightened earlier? Even if I had been enlightened half a day earlier, my friends in the caravan wouldn't have been killed by the horse gang." After a long time, I finally understood this truth. Everyone has different reasons for enlightenment and lucky chances. When the lucky chance comes, it comes. If it doesn't, you can't force it. Ning Ke understood that the master's words were to remind him. Huang Yang monk continued, "Blood is not fire. It shouldn't be spicy and can't be burned. However, for me at that time, blood was spicy and could burn my clothes, flesh, and even Buddha's heart. If enlightenment is the perception of the law of the chi of heaven and earth, then everyone's enlightenment should be different. Only what you feel is true, and what others teach you is false. So you don't have to worry. Take your time, and you will be enlightened eventually." Ning Ke pondered in silence for a long time. Then, he bowed deeply and walked down from the Wanyan Tower. A moment later, Li Qingshan, the master of nation of Tang, came in from nowhere. He looked at Huang Yang monk and said, "Thank you very much." Huang Yang monk shook his head and said, "With so many contacts in such a short time, don't you worry that he will have problems." Li Qingshan said calmly, "A divine talisman master who has already stood at the threshold, a virtuous brother of the Buddhism sect, and those eccentrics in the second floor of the academy. With such a lineup to guide a young man who has just entered the cultivation world, if he doesn't have any problems, then his future must be promising. If this still doesn't work, then, we can only wait for the headmaster of academy to return home." The grand cultivators who stood at the top of the Tang Empire were all devoted to the education of Ning Quebec. Just as the nation master Li Qingshan had said, such a lineup might not be impossible in the future, but it was highly unlikely to appear in the past. After a moment of silence, Huang Yang monk smiled and said, "I hope he can live up to your expectations in the future." The military ministry and the Imperial Center administration have also investigated him in detail. His loyalty to the Tang Empire is beyond doubt. Being able to enter the second floor of the academy means that he has enough potential, and even has the possibility to become a divine talisman master in the future. The most important thing is that he is not like other cultivators who are ignorant of worldly affairs and walk in the clouds. Instead, he acts calmly and coldly. When encountering an enemy, he dares to kill and is willing to use any means. How could His Majesty miss such a young man? Not to mention the fate of that calligraphy section. His painstaking efforts to cultivate him with such a lineup is not because we old guys expect him to grow up and bring glory to us in the future, but because the Tang Empire needs young people like him in the future. Since that day in the palace, Ning Ke had sent some calligraphy sections to the Tang Empire through the bodyguard office after eating the exquisite but not filling royal meal of cold fire autumn smoke. He had never entered the palace again, nor had he met the emperor of the Tang Empire. Therefore, he did not know that he had become the most important candidate for the Tang Empire's talent cultivation plan. However, after talking with Master Huang Yang at Wanyan Tower today, he more or less guessed some things. The reason why the younger brother of the Tang Empire could come out in person, besides the face of Master Yen Sei, must be because of the palace. Even if he had guessed some things, he was not shocked, especially compared to a few days ago in the southern city, when his master pointed to the picturesque landscape and said that the safety of this magnificent city would be handed over to him in the future. But of course, he would feel touched. A few days after the talk at Wanyan Tower, he had been thinking about Master Huang Yang's words, especially the word enlightenment. The more he thought about it, the more he was sure that the Enlightenment Buddhism sect paid attention to, if put in the system of ordinary cultivation methods, was actually see-through, which was the preliminary mastery of the operation of the Qi of heaven and earth. At this time, Ning Ke's state was still at no doubt state, only a small distance away from the lower state of see-through. The same was true for talisman Taoism. He was only a little bit away from drawing that talisman, but this seemingly small distance was actually the most difficult part. Seeing that there was only one step away from climbing the dangerous peak, but that step could not be taken, no matter who it was, they would inevitably feel anxious and anxious. A few days ago, Ning Ke did manage to be calm, but of course, deep in his heart, he had been looking forward to the arrival of that day. It was not until he heard Master Huang Yang's words about enlightenment at Wanyan Tower that he suddenly realized that these seemingly peaceful and natural expectations were also a kind of anxiety and an obstacle to cultivation. After pondering for a night, Ning Ke no longer thought about these things. See-through and talisman Taoism were all left behind by him. He would still go to the academy's back mountain to listen to songs, forge iron and gossip, and still walk around the famous places in Chang'an. But he no longer thought about when he would be able to reach see-through, nor did he think about when he would be able to put down the first stroke on that piece of white paper. Looking at the eaves of the famous buildings, he no longer wanted to feel anything from them. Instead, he just purely appreciated the beauty among them, reflecting and imprinting those lines into his eyes. One day in midsummer. In the afternoon, the old brush pen shop was shrouded in unbearable heat and humidity. Ning Ke leaned on the bamboo chair under the tree, staring at the sky divided by branches and green leaves in a daze. From time to time, he picked up a wet towel from the basin beside the chair and patted it on his body, washing away the greasy sweat and summer heat with the well water. Change the water quickly. The water in the basin is hot again. What kind of weather is this? Get some fresh cold well water quickly. He was not anxious about cultivation, but anxious about the heat. He shouted to the front. In order to resist the endless stream of admirers and stewards of mansions, the old brush pen shop was now open for 2 days and 3 days when its owner got married. Sang Sang was really bored during the day, so she wiped the tables and chairs in the front shop again and again. At this time, hearing Ning Kei's angry shout in the courtyard, she hurriedly ran out and poured the old water in the basin under the tree, and then went to the well to get new water. At this moment, the long-awaited rain fell, hitting the eaves and leaves with pitter-patter. Then, it quickly turned into a torrential downpour. The rain was like thunder, but it could not drown out the ecstatic shouts of the neighbors in the back alley. "Young master, quickly go into the house to hide." Sang Sang threw down the basin and hurriedly closed the window. Ning Kei lay on the bamboo chair, but did not move. He looked at the rain falling from the sky, feeling the brittle feeling of the raindrops hitting his naked skin, and the wetness that enveloped the street. His expression seemed a little strange. Sang Sang looked at him from the window and shouted, "Why don't you come in?" Ning Kei opened his eyes and looked at the increasingly dense rain. He suddenly shouted, "Look, it's so beautiful." Sang Sang thought that the young master was talking nonsense again. She waited for a long time and found that Ning Kei was still lying on the bamboo chair. Although she was not worried that he would catch a cold on such a hot day, she was very worried that he would become a fool in the rain. Frowning, she walked out of the door, walked to the bamboo chair, and imitated him to look up at the sky. Seeing that she looked up with difficulty, Ning Kei stretched out his hand to hold her waist, and held her in his arms. The master and the servant lay side by side on the bamboo chair, lying in the majestic heavy rain, and opened their eyes to look at the sky. Sang Sang looked at the rain coming like arrows, and said in surprise, "It's really beautiful." Ning Kei wiped the rain off her face and asked, "Do you feel that we are like the rain eaves under 1,000 years of wind and rain?" Sang Sang shook her head and said, "I don't think so. I feel like the city wall is being shot by many arrows." Ning Kei sighed and said, "What an unromantic girl." At night, the rain gradually stopped. Sang Sang began to cook. After drying his body, Ning Kei came to the desk in front of the window again. He poured water into the inkstone, ground the ink, and picked up the brush, as natural and ordinary as he had done every time for more than 10 years. The white paper on the desk was still the original one. The edges had been rolled up after dozens of days, but the top was still white. He looked away from the page of the Talisman Classics, and then looked at the rain dripping from the eaves. Then he lowered his wrist and put down the brush. The full tip of the brush, like a treetop full of rain, gently fell on the snow-white paper. 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, 6 lines. 6 lines were finished. Ning Kei took a deep breath and put down the brush. Sang Sang came in with 2 big bowls of soy sauce rice, put them aside, and walked to the desk to look at it curiously. Then she looked up at the roof, slightly frowning, and said unhappily, "It's leaking. Isn't this a new house built in the 4th year of the Tianqi era? Young master, you have to talk to Mr. Qi tomorrow to reduce the rent." Ning Kei shook his head helplessly and said, "When did we pay the rent? Besides, the house is not leaking." "It's not leaking. Young master, did you get a fever because of the rain? Do you need me to go to the pharmacy?" Sang Sang pointed to the white paper on the desk and looked at Ning Kei with concern. However, before she could finish, Ning Kei pulled her thin body into his arms. Sang Sang felt that the young master seemed to be very emotional today, so she could only helplessly open her arms and let him hold her. Ning Kei held her tightly. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile in her ear, "Tell all the people in Chang and who want to invite me to dinner that from today on, I have time to go to their mansions for dinner." Hearing this, Sang Sang's body slightly stiffened, and she looked at the desk again. The 6 ink marks on the snow-white paper on the desk had disappeared. There was only a big puddle of water. Not rain. It was water. I had originally planned to write 3,000 words, but as I was writing and writing, I got too excited. So I wrote 6,000 words and finished writing this huge plot. Alright, I'm really happy. At such a happy time, I'll feel sorry for myself if I don't ask for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Anyway, you know that recommendation votes are my life. I can ask for monthly votes casually, but you really can't give them casually, you have to give them hard. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 181. Of course, Ning Ke was very happy to draw the first talisman in his life. Then he calmed down and sighed with emotion. But he was not as ecstatic as he was when he embarked on the road of cultivation last year. Cultivation had tortured him for more than 10 years. He had been desperate but suddenly succeeded. But talisman Taoism was a matter of course. He knew that he could understand it, but he did not know when he could. Of course, it was impossible for him to announce it to the whole world. He only told the people closest to him. Then, he was surprised to find that the reaction of these people was even stronger than his. For a moment, he couldn't help but wonder who wrote the water talisman on the snow-white paper on the desk. Sang Sang went to the Victory House to invite a chef to make the table noodles. Senior brothers and sisters in the back mountain of the academy spread the news. They thought that their youngest brother would be obsessed with talisman Taoism and would not practice the flying sword anymore. So their heads and the butt of the big white goose would be much safer. So they danced with their hands and feet, played the flute and played the zither. After Master Yen Sei knew the news, he sat in the Southern Gate Temple for a while and then went to the House of Red Sleeves to indulge in drinking. When he was drunk, 2 lines of tears flowed down his old face. On the 3rd day after the summer rain, the highly respected old chancellor of the Tang Empire held a banquet in his mansion with a random excuse. Dozens of officials were invited to the banquet. They drank and made merry under the rain-shielding veranda in the courtyard. Everyone was confused, but it was not appropriate for them to ask. Naturally, the important figures of the imperial court would not sit in the courtyard with these middle-level officials. Instead, they were chatting with the old chancellor in the main room. As they listened to the chancellor's hearty laughter, the doubts in their hearts were even stronger than those of the officials outside. They were all guessing what kind of joyous event had happened that could actually make the stern old chancellor, who led the literary world with his scholarly articles, so happy. Could it be that the border army had conquered a large piece of territory for the empire, or that the old chancellor's granddaughter was about to get married? On such an occasion, no matter what happened, everyone should have fun. But looking at the white-haired old chancellor sitting on the left side of the old chancellor, even the minister of the Ministry of Rights could not say much. That person was Wang Shichen, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Library. Throughout the entire imperial court, apart from the Prime Minister and a few others, only this Grand Secretary would dare to disrespect the old chancellor. Moreover, everyone knew that these 2 elders had never gotten along. The Chancellor and the Grand Scholar hadn't been on good terms with each other for a long time, but it had nothing to do with the political opinions or the internal strife. The great Tang placed great importance on the law, and even the nobles did not dare to violate it. The various departments acted according to the law, and although there were no harsh punishments, it was extremely difficult to brush past the edges of the law. As a result, no minister dared to form a clique for personal gain. The few ministers and ministers in the main room knew clearly that the hatred between the 2 old chancellors stemmed from a love affair decades ago. At that time, both of them were students of the academy. They shared the same room and shared a deep friendship. It was a pity that they shared the same room with a young girl, and the girl was the Prime Minister's daughter. Her temperament was unbelievably good, and the most unfortunate thing was that the Prime Minister only had one daughter, so, Wang Shichen, the Grand Secretary, sneered and stroked his white beard. He looked at the old chancellor and said, "I heard that you often sent stewards to Lin 47th Street recently, and even bought a few sections from others." "That's right. Are you jealous?" The old chancellor smiled and looked at him, saying, "Don't talk about losing the face of the imperial court. Ning Ke is a student of the academy, and we are old acquaintances. Moreover, he has entered the second floor. What's more, I have to show him respect even though I'm much older. I heard that your steward often goes to the old brush pen shop these days. Why do you have to talk about me? Look, if you didn't have a guilty conscience, why would you answer so many questions with just a few questions?" Grand Secretary Wang sneered and said sarcastically, "Ning Ke's calligraphy is really good. His Majesty likes it, and so do I. What's wrong with me sending someone to the old brush pen shop? I just sympathize with you. You have been searching everywhere, and I don't know if you have found any authentic works." Before the old chancellor answered, Grand Secretary Wang laughed and looked at his colleagues around the table. He said, "I think you all know that Sir Ning's chicken soup calligraphy is now in my mansion. I have a look at it when I have time for official business. It's really a good feeling." The old chancellor slightly raised his eyebrows. He knew that this sentence was directed at him. Grand Secretary Wang slightly raised his eyebrows and continued to say, "Intentionally or unintentionally, there are many sections of Ning Ke's calligraphy circulating outside. But except for this chicken soup calligraphy with the hidden meaning of divine talisman, I don't think there is another one that can be compared with the flower blooming calligraphy in the palace. It did take me some effort to get this chicken soup calligraphy. If I didn't have some friendship with Master Yen Sei, how could I get it?" He turned to the old chancellor and said with a smile, "Old guy, I heard that your steward also went to the House of Red Sleeves to buy 2 rubbings of the Yen family of the chicken soup calligraphy. Why do you do that? If you really want to see the authentic chicken soup calligraphy, just tell me. Why do you specially invite me to have this meal? Why do you have to bother so many colleagues to accompany you?" The old chancellor breathed heavily. He put his hands on the table and sneered, "If I want to see it, you will send it to my mansion. Don't even think about it." Grand Secretary Wang smiled and said, "His Majesty knows that the chicken soup calligraphy is in my mansion and has asked me for it 3 times. I didn't do it. The chicken soup calligraphy will definitely not come back to the palace. If I send it to your mansion, you will definitely not give it back to me. How can I be fooled? His Majesty has been to my mansion twice this month. If you want to see it, just come to my mansion." Big Head Wang. Don't bully me too much. The old chancellor slammed the table and scolded harshly. The master of moral essay called Wang Shichen by his nickname in the academy out of anger today. It was really unbearable. If it were in normal times, Wang Shichen would probably scold him. However, he had the absolute upper hand with the chicken soup calligraphy today. He could show pity to the loser. He shook his head indifferently and said sympathetically, "You are too impolite. You are too impolite." The old chancellor thought of the purpose of today's banquet. He forcibly suppressed his anger and sat down slowly. He sneered and said, "Today I have another purpose for this banquet." "Just you? Do you think you have a big head and a big face?" Grand Secretary Wang smiled slightly and did not care. Finally, this sentence is used again. The 2 senior statesmen quarreled and mocked each other. The ministers and chancellors at the table did not dare to interrupt. They were used to this scene and knew that it was useless to persuade them. So they could only maintain an awkward silence. Not long after, there was a slight sound in the courtyard. It seemed that a guest had arrived. Grand Secretary Wang looked out of the threshold and frowned slightly. The old chancellor smiled and looked at the young man who walked into the courtyard surrounded by several young men. He stroked his long beard with satisfaction and squinted at him. He said, "The authentic chicken soup calligraphy. Let's take a look at the owner of the chicken soup calligraphy first." At this time, these bigwigs of the imperial court had already guessed the identity of the young man. Although they more or less knew this person before, they could not help but sigh in their hearts when they found that he was so young. Grand Secretary Wang's expression was very ugly. In spring, the entire Chang'an city was shocked by the appearance of the owner of the flower-blooming calligraphy. Many high-ranking officials and nobles wanted to get close to this person in order to please the emperor. Even Ning Ke himself had sent a steward to invite this person to his mansion for a chat. However, no one expected that this person would turn a blind eye to all the invitations and continue to live peacefully in the shabby alley. Usually, if a calligrapher showed this kind of attitude to the bigwigs of the empire, even if he was the second master of calligrapher, he would be instantly defeated until no one paid attention to him. However, this young calligrapher was quite favored by His Majesty and was also a student of the second floor of the academy. Even these high-ranking officials and nobles did not dare to do anything to him and could only let him be with love and hate. As time passed, the Chang'an prefectures found that this person treated everyone like this and had never attended the banquet of the He family. They thought that cultivators had many different interests and gradually did not care about it. When it was time to buy the calligraphy, he still did not show any mercy. However, who would have thought that today, this person actually appeared at the banquet of the old chancellor? The Tang officials inside and outside the courtyard were all extremely smart people. It only took a moment for them to roughly guess why this calligrapher made an exception. Wang Shichen sneered and turned to look at the old chancellor. He said sarcastically, "Congratulations on having a good granddaughter." The hidden meaning in this sentence was actually a little vicious. But just like Grand Secretary Wang's previous verbal attack on the old chancellor, only the winner was qualified to be forgiven. The old chancellor smiled and mocked, "Who told your granddaughter to be unable to enter the academy?" This sentence was the biggest regret of Grand Secretary Wang in the past 3 years. His expression slightly changed and his fingers slightly trembled. He pointed at the old chancellor's face and angrily scolded, "You old man, don't be so proud." The old chancellor sighed and said, "As the first old man in Chang'an to invite Sir Ning to his mansion, it is hard not to be proud." Grand Secretary Wang looked back at Ning Ke who had walked out of the threshold and said angrily, "Do you need to look at an old hen to drink chicken soup?" The old chancellor smiled generously and shook his head with a sigh. "You are so out of control. There was a heavy rain in midsummer the day before yesterday." Ning Ke wrote an ink talisman on the snow-white paper and then said that sentence to Sang Sang. Then he began to go to the banquets of each family. The master and the handmaiden checked and found that they had actually collected more than a dozen invitations and name cards in just a month or two. He was very clear that the reason why these bigwigs in Chang'an treated him so courteously was all for the sake of His Majesty. Previously, he treated everyone equally and did not go to any family. Of course, he was not afraid because he was at the back of the mountain of the academy. But once he started to go to the banquets, he must pay attention to the order. Otherwise, if he offended some bigwigs in the imperial court because of etiquette, even the academy could not help him. Yesterday at the lakeside of the academy, he seriously consulted Situelon and finally decided to put the invitation to the old chancellor's mansion as the first one. The reason was very simple. Since the old chancellor was a noble and civil official, it was natural for him to meet him as a junior disciple. More importantly, it was because Jin Wuxia was his classmate. This kind of relationship could not be found anywhere in the world. Of course, the dishes in the old chancellor's mansion were much better than those in the imperial palace. But they were too bland, and the conversation was really not very interesting. Ning Ke honestly and humbly answered the questions in accordance with the unchangeable truth that these bigwigs gave him face, which was that he had to return the face back to them. He behaved very well. After the banquet, the old chancellor naturally asked people to bring up the brush, ink, paper and inkstone, and asked Ning Ke to leave a letter. After leaving the letter, Jin Wuxia and Situelon saw him out of the mansion together. The three chatted for a while, and then Ning Ke knew that Xie Qingyun had returned to the South Jin Kingdom when he was busy understanding Talisman Taoism. Ning Ke noticed that when Situelon mentioned Xie Qingyun, Jin Wuxia's expression was still calm, but her eyes were a little sad. He could not help but sigh. Since they had started to attend the banquet, it was impossible for them to just stay in one family. The next day, according to the meal schedule arranged by Situelan, he was supposed to visit the Minister of the Ministry of Rights. However, because he met Grand Secretary Wang at the old Chancellor's mansion last night, he had no choice but to go to the Grand Secretary Wang's mansion for dinner. Before Ning Ke agreed with him at the table, he had clearly felt that if he did not agree with the white-haired Grand Secretary Wang, the latter would really send someone to Lin 47th Street to smash his shop. The banquet in the Grand Secretary Wang's mansion was more exaggerated than that in the old Chancellor's mansion. It was obvious that the old man did not treat Ning Ke as an old hen who would simply feed him some rice. Instead, he invited all the capable officials of the 6 ministries and 3 academies to the mansion. If one counted carefully, he would find that more than half of the officials who were qualified to attend the court meeting were standing in the courtyard. Looking at the dense crowd of officials in the courtyard and the various official uniforms, Ning Ke was so shocked that he was completely speechless. He thought to himself, what did this lad do? He was just a bad calligrapher. How could he deserve such a grand ceremony? However, Grand Secretary Wang thought that he deserved it. He even took Ning Ke's hand and stood in front of the steps, making a very grand introduction. For the Academy and the headmaster, for the Imperial Palace and His Majesty, for the Southern Gate Temple and Yen Se, Grand Secretary Wang did not mind giving face. Of course, he also vaguely wanted to put on airs. On the one hand, he wanted to use these officials to announce to the whole empire that Ning Ke had come for dinner. On the other hand, he wanted to use these officials to announce to Ning Ke that he treated him more attentively than the old Chancellor. In the future, if Ning Ke had any calligraphy, he should show it to me first. If His Majesty had any instructions, he should let me know first. Before the banquet was over, Grand Secretary Wang took out the treasured chicken soup calligraphy and asked the officials to appreciate it. Finally, he asked Ning Ke to take out his private seal and solemnly stamp his own seal on the memo paper that had been repaired but was still wrinkled. Ning Ke lifted his finger slightly, and the seal left the surface of the chicken soup calligraphy, leaving a dazzling bright red. There was jubilation in the Grand Secretary's mansion. The officials cheered and applauded. The steward of the mansion was proud and moved, and the servants whispered. Old Sang, who had followed the Grand Secretary all the way from his hometown to Chang'an and had served the Grand Secretary for nearly 70 years, was moved to tears. He held his walking stick and looked at the brightly lit courtyard. He said in a trembling voice, "Old master, young master has finally won against the old Jin. The hatred of stealing his wife has finally been somewhat avenged." After doing this, Ning Ke heaved a sigh of relief. He thought that this was probably the case. However, he did not expect that Grand Secretary Wang did not intend to let him leave. Instead, he ordered people to set up the writing brushes, ink, paper and inkstone, just like the old Chancellor had done last night. Looking at the speed of the steward setting up the brushes, ink, paper and inkstone, no one in the hall would believe that they did not carry out emergency overtime training. Ning Ke stared blankly at the ridiculously large Huangzhou sprout paper in front of him. He wanted to cry but had no tears. He thought to himself that the old Chancellor had only taken an ordinary scroll last night. Did he want him to write a Grand Central Hall? Isn't this a little too cruel? After leaving the Grand Secretary's mansion, he said to Sang Sang sadly, "Don't ever attend such banquets again." Sang Sang asked confusedly, "Young master, you said a few days ago that if you want to achieve great things, you can't just rely on one skill. Although you are determined to cultivate, you also need to build a good relationship with the bigwigs in the secular world. Why do you say not to attend such banquets again now? I'm still good at eating, chatting, praising the sage, and flattering people because I'm a thick-skinned person." Ning Ke shook his head and said with emotion, "However, I have to leave a piece of calligraphy after eating. Yesterday it was an ordinary scroll, and today it has become a Grand Central Hall. What should I write when the Marquis invites me to dinner tomorrow? Should I fill the white wall that the Marquis just painted with calligraphy? These bigwigs are not inviting me to dinner. They are completely robbing me of my money. I'm really happy when I write about old Sung. In fact, I'm still tired from writing, and I'm not in good spirits. That's why I've stayed up until now. It's past midnight, and I don't have to send out individual chapters to solicit recommendation votes. I'm sincerely inviting you here. The recommendation votes on Monday are very important, and I hope everyone can support me. Please come to my appointment to solicit votes. We eat rice, but what flows out must be votes. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien to cast a recommendation vote or a monthly vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Whether it was the wrinkled old men or the immature young men, they all had calm and resolute expressions, as if they hadn't just traveled thousands of miles to the south, but had lived here for many years. They were a part of the army of the Northern Wasteland tribe. In other words, they were a part of all the men who could fight in the Northern Wasteland tribe. In this southern expedition, all the men who could fight in the Northern Wasteland tribe were gathered here. There was no army. Instead, all the men who could fight were gathered on the edge of the grassland that stretched for hundreds of miles. All the old, weak, women, and children of the tribe were left behind. It would take about a month to reach the edge of the grassland. If the men could not win this war and take over the grassland, then their families in the wilderness behind them would definitely be swallowed by the darkness, cold, hunger, and the blades of the enemy. For countless years, the Northern Wasteland tribe lived in the cold region of the far north, relying on the hot sea to survive. It was impossible for them to sustain too many people. In recent years, as the nights strangely lengthened, the temperature gradually dropped, and their lives became more and more difficult. At the end of winter, the tribal elders finally decided to move the whole tribe south. If they did not move south, there would be no food. In the south, there were large grasslands, sheep, and food. It was a pity that the god was not generous when he gave the land to the humans. Most of the land already had an owner, including this large piece of fertile grassland. If the people of the northern wilderness wanted the grassland and the food for the sheep, the original owner would not be happy. So, then they would fight. After 1,000 years, the desolate man reappeared in the eyes of the world. This matter should have shocked the world. However, the people who once roared proudly on the grassland and defeated the countries in the Central Plains had left the world for too long. It was so long that many people had forgotten their existence. Moreover, the dangerous natural environment and the torture of time had reduced the tribe's population to the point that people did not feel any threat. Therefore, this matter was temporarily limited to the northern grassland. The reason for this situation also had a lot to do with the wise decision of the desolate man's tribal elders. Before moving south, the desolate man had set a firm and clear goal. The grassland that the sword pointed at belonged to the barbarian Lieutenant Khan, and had nothing to do with the countries in the Central Plains, especially the powerful and terrifying empire. Although the desolate man's soldiers were brave, they had been cautiously suppressing the war in the northern area of the grassland. It had been nearly a month since the desolate man's southern expedition troops arrived at the northern edge of the grassland, and the battle with the barbarian Lieutenant Khan's cavalry had been going on for a month. On this battle line that was deliberately controlled to a length of hundreds of kilometers, the two sides had fought no less than 100 battles, and most of them ended in the desolate man's victory. The cruelty of war was that even the winner had to pay the price of death. The desolate man's soldiers were silent and resolute, brave and disciplined, and their individual combat effectiveness was far above that of the grassland barbarians. However, they were too few in number. Although they continuously defeated the tide-like attacks of the Lieutenant Khan's 100,000 cavalry, more and more of their companions died. An earth stove, an iron pot, fresh water, and mutton. Not far away on the grassland were the corpses of their companions that had congealed in a pool of blood. A desolate man sorcerer, whose face was smeared with tree sap, walked calmly among the corpses. From time to time, he squatted down and gently touched the eyebrows of the dead with his fingers. His dry lips moved slightly, making indecipherable syllables. Not far from the corpses of the soldiers, a desolate man-boy of about 13 or 14 years old blew the bone flute in his hand. The sound of the flute was mournful, as if it was telling the desolate man's pain of wandering and struggling for survival in the past 1,000 years. An old voice was added to the sound of the flute. It was a highly respected true master of the Council of Elders. He sang a song that all the desolate men could sing. The song was desolate and vigorous, with a shocking unyieldingness in the solemn and stirring atmosphere. The sky is cold, the earth is cold, the goshawk does not dare to look at the northern wilderness. The hot sea falls, the hot sea rises, the snow wolf is hunted by the hot sea. The snow wolf chases, the snow wolf dies, holding a knife to look for the deer all day long. Where to live, where to die, where to bury the white bones. Min Mountain is majestic, Min Mountain is strong, Min Mountain is the true hometown. Stepping over the vast snow, stepping over the frost for thousands of miles, looking south all day long. Stepping over the vast snow, stepping over the frost for thousands of miles, no longer looking south. I go first, and then you come. I fight first, and then you come. I die first, and then you come. The homeward journey is near, the homeward journey is far, the homeward journey is on. I have gone, and then you come. I have fought, and then you come. I have died, and then you come. I have died, and then you come. I have died, and then you come. The bleak song kept repeating the last two lines, and several young desolate man-warriors silently looked over there. As the old man sang softly, a strong but not sad atmosphere arose on the grassland. Most of the desolate man-warriors remained silent. They ate the mutton and drank the oily soup that had a strong odor. They seized every moment to replenish their strength in between the battles because no one knew when the next battle would begin. The ancestors of the desolate man were once called natural warriors by the people of the Central Plains. Now they had experienced thousands of years of harsh environment, and the word fighting was written in their blood vessels and bones. The death of their companions would not make them feel the slightest bit. Even the song that had been passed down for thousands of years could only trigger the soft echo deep in their hearts, but could not interfere with their preparation for the battle. At this moment, the bugle of the battle sounded again. The grassland trembled slightly, and no one knew how many elite cavalries of the Khan of the left tent were coming. The desolate man-warriors did not panic. They put down the mutton and spoon in their hands, raised their sleeves to wipe their oily faces, and then picked up the heavy and damaged weapons beside them. They slowly walked south, and even did not forget to put out the fire in the earthen stove. They walked slowly, then quickly, then trotted, and finally began to sprint. The way the desolate man soldiers entered the battlefield was shockingly similar to the way the grassland cavalries did. The only difference was that they did not ride on horses and only had their own legs. However, what was incredible was that these desolate man soldiers, who were wearing leather robes and holding knives and axes, who did not look very tall or strong, could run at such a fast speed and with such a shocking momentum. With the dense buzzing sound of drums, the grassland cavalries who were good at riding and shooting pulled the bowstrings of their short bows from a long distance away. Countless arrows cut through the sky and hit thousands of desolate man warriors like raindrops. With a puff, a sharp arrow hit a desolate man warrior who was running at high speed. After the arrowhead penetrated the leather armor, it seemed to take root in his chest. Blood quickly seeped out and dyed the leather armor red. However, the desolate man warrior did not seem to notice it and still rushed towards the black tide-like cavalries with sabers and axes in his hands. Obviously, the arrow was blocked by the desolate man's steel-like skin and did not hurt his vital parts. There were no military orders or flag signals. The desolate man's battle relied on their instincts, the tacit understanding and the trust they had in their companions after fighting side by side for more than 1,000 years. When they were dozens of steps away from the black tide-like grassland cavalries, as long as they were not shot down by the cavalry's arrows, they pulled out the sharp axes from their waists neatly and threw them out with all their strength. The sharp axes rotated at high speed and cut through the air on the battlefield. The bright light reflected the sunlight and reflected snow-white shadows on the green grassland. It looked extremely beautiful and terrifying. With their strong defensive power, the desolate man warriors withstood the grassland cavalry's first round of shooting and entered the effective killing range of the flying axes. They ran so fast that the grassland cavalries did not have time to launch the second round of shooting and had to throw the axes in their hands. The rain of arrows did not hit too many desolate man warriors on the grassland, but the rain of thousands of sharp axes directly caused the grassland cavalries to suffer the cruelest blow. The originally heavy axes, coupled with the desolate man warriors throwing strength and rotation, easily cut through the cavalry's light armor. Even the ends of the axes directly broke the grassland cavalry's bones and spurted blood. To say a few very important things, first, after I finished writing last night, I was working on the next chapter's outline. I was deducing and overruling it all the way. I don't know if I was excited by the future plot or depressed by the level of trouble. Anyway, I had insomnia and couldn't fall asleep until noon. So I didn't sleep at all and hoped to adjust my biological clock again. However, I really couldn't stand it in the afternoon. I spent 4 to 5 hours writing this chapter. The quality and mood should be fine, but I really don't know the words because my eyes are blurry. I will go to sleep after eating the food my leader brought back. If I wake up tomorrow, I will try to write more. There is another very important thing to report to everyone, which is the annual selection. To be honest, with the help of everyone, I won the best author 2 years ago and the best novel last year. I am really grateful and satisfied. I really don't know what to do this year. Anyway, if you want to vote for me for free, I am still deeply grateful. But please don't spend money to vote for me. I really have nothing to ask for. The book review section moderators also have the best novel selection, but I don't know why our moderators are not in the designated range. Scratching my head, they have really worked hard these months. I am very clear about this, so I want to take this opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to them. Bye, everyone. This paragraph does not count. What I said before is really not polite, I really have nothing to ask for. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 183. The sharp axes that whistled through the air and then fell deeply into the warhorses' heads, cutting off the grassland cavalrymen's arms. Along with a sudden muffled howl, countless warhorses fell to the ground miserably and the grassland men on the warhorses also fell to the ground miserably. Death and blood did not destroy the grassland cavalrymen's will to fight. Instead, it made the elite cavalrymen under the direct command of the left king's palace more aggressive. They waved the machetes in their hands and roared as they charged forward against the rain of axes. Contrary to the almost crazy grassland cavalrymen, the desolate man soldiers had remained silent since the beginning of the battle. Whether it was running at high speed, dodging the rain of arrows, falling to the ground due to injuries, or throwing the flying axes with all their strength, they kept their lips tightly shut. On the battlefield that was filled with blood and broken limbs, the silence was even more terrifying. However, if there were bystanders at the edge of the battlefield, in their eyes, the grassland cavalrymen who were charging forward with wild roars had far surpassed the silent desolate man soldiers in terms of momentum. The black tides formed by the grassland cavalrymen finally approached the silent desolate man soldiers and collided with them for the first time. What was incredible was that the silent desolate man soldiers, who appeared to be lacking momentum, were not scattered by the heavy cavalry. They stood in the black tide like reefs and were not scattered. A young desolate man soldier squatted down and slashed his long saber from his waist. The grassland cavalrymen who were charging towards him were shocked and suddenly lowered their heads. The warhorse under them screamed and its two front legs were neatly chopped off. A strong desolate man soldier looked at the grassland cavalrymen who were charging towards him. He stepped forward with his right foot, lowered his body and bent his waist, and slammed into them with his shoulder. No matter how one looked at it, a human body hitting a horse was suicidal. However, this strong desolate man's shoulder was as hard as steel. The angle he chose to hit was so accurate that he just avoided the cavalry's machete and hit the warhorse's front leg, the shoulder blade, the most vulnerable part. There was a muffled howl from a man or a horse. The warhorse neighed and rolled over. The grassland cavalryman on the horse perfectly demonstrated his riding skills at this moment. He flipped over and got off the saddle, avoiding the tragic ending of being crushed by the heavy warhorse. However, just as his feet landed on the ground, the strong desolate man soldier's long saber came whistling and chopped off his head. Splash! The black tide formed by the grassland cavalryman came over. The desolate man soldier stood in the black tide with his long saber in his hand and was instantly engulfed. But after a while, the black tide splashed with countless waves of blood. However, these mature and naive desolate man soldiers once again surfaced and faced the second tide with blood all over their bodies. The tide overflowed the reef and then slowly receded. The reef still stood silently by the sea, as if it would never be washed away by the tide even after millions of years. The desolate warriors were not senseless reefs. In the face of the black tide of grassland cavalries, they did not choose to remain silent forever and fight recklessly. Instead, they made a second response at the fastest speed. Their feet, which were tied with animal skins, ran quickly on the grassland that had hardened due to the cold. Bringing grass and dirt with them, the desolate man warriors were like countless shadows weaving through the black tide of grassland cavalries. They avoided the accurate arrows, the sharp machetes, and the impact of the warhorses. They stayed close to each other tacitly and surrounded the grassland cavalrymen in the middle of the black tide in groups of 5. The scene was wonderful. The black tide of the grassland cavalrymen had flooded the entire battlefield, but they could not engulf these desolate man soldiers in the shortest time. And those desolate man soldiers did not care about the sabers and arrows behind them. They did not care about the grassland cavalrymen who were surrounded by 5 people. Some of them waved their long sabers and rushed up silently and fiercely. The long sabers were sharp and cut through the air. Their feet flashed like the wind. Wherever blood splashed, some grassland cavalrymen fell from their saddles and were instantly cut into pieces by the saber wind. The grassland cavalrymen on the periphery and the cavalrymen who had already rushed past the battle line could not make any effective rescue. They tried their best to shoot the arrows, but the number of desolate man soldiers they could kill was extremely limited. With their horrifying close defense power and unimaginable running speed, the battle on the vast grassland, which should have been one-sided or even a massacre between the cavalrymen and the infantry, was developing in an incredible direction. In fact, since the desolate man tribe moved south and began to fight with the Lieutenant Khan's tribe, this scene, which was completely against the grassland cavalrymen's fighting philosophy, had been playing out. The most terrible thing in a battle was not failure, but when you found that the ideas you had learned in the past battles and the most effective fighting methods suddenly became ineffective. This kind of mental blow could directly make people lose their confidence in fighting. In the previous battles, the grassland cavalrymen had suffered a crushing defeat because of this inexplicable mental panic. Every time they launched a seemingly foolproof charge, they found that the charge did not have any effect. Instead, they became the targets of those thin desolate men. No matter how strong the troops were and how strict the battlefield discipline was, they could not stop the subsequent collapse. According to the process of the previous battles, the grassland cavalrymen should have had a nervous breakdown at this time, and then they would withdraw from the battlefield in a panic. Then they would gather again to rest and recover their spirit and physical strength, and wait for the next charge. Then they would collapse and fail again. But today's situation was obviously a little different. The cavalrymen who were surrounded by the desolate man soldiers on foot did not collapse. They had long been mentally prepared for the outcome of death, so they burst out with extremely fearless courage and desperately waved the machetes in their hands before dying. Although they could not avoid falling under the long machetes of the desolate man soldiers in the end, the desolate man soldiers often had to pay a higher price to kill a grassland cavalryman than the previous times. Around the central battlefield where the blood waves were dense, the grassland cavalrymen who were supposed to support their trapped comrades did not hesitate to lift the reins and leave after hearing a low horn. They did not care that their companions were falling under the siege of the desolate man soldiers. Instead, they divided into two teams at the fastest speed and left the central battlefield in the east and west direction. The huge waves that were crashing against the reef suddenly split into two, leaving only the remnant waves in the middle that were still stuck to the black reef. And behind the fork where the two teams of grassland cavalrymen separated, a gorgeous carriage came slowly. The carriage was decorated with gold and silver and looked extremely gorgeous. In the middle of the carriage was a round plate made of refined steel. The lines on the plate were so dense that they seemed to be even more complicated than the hundreds of millions of stars in the night sky. On both sides of the metal plate stood two expressionless grassland brawny men who were wearing heavy metal armors and holding heavy and sharp machetes in their hands. The countries of the Central Plains strictly controlled the output of salt and iron. It was extremely rare to see full metal heavy armors on the grassland here. The soldiers who were qualified to wear heavy armors must be the bravest and most powerful warriors with the highest status in each palace. Today, the task of these two most powerful warriors of the Left Khan's palace of the grassland was not to fight, but to protect the metal plate on the carriage and the person sitting on the plate. There was a skinny old man sitting on the metal plate. The old man was wearing a golden royal costume with an agate ring on his left finger and a rune painted with wolf's blood between his eyebrows, which told everyone his identity. He was one of the 7 most respected grand wizards of the Left Khan's palace. The old sorcerer expressionlessly looked at the warriors who were still fighting on the grassland in the distance. His withered lips moved rapidly, his skinny 10 fingers continuously tapped on the metal disc, like the beating of a war drum, mixed with the incantation that was spat out from his lips, as if it had an extremely magical power. In the originally azure sky, a cloud suddenly floated over, just in time to block the pale sun, casting a shadow on the bloody grassland at the center of the battlefield. At that moment, some of the older desolate man warriors had noticed that the grassland cavalrymen were behaving strangely today. When they noticed that the grassland cavalrymen, who were supposed to attack them desperately, suddenly drove to the periphery, leaving nearly 1,000 of their companions behind, with a few deep shouts, the desolate man warriors sped up the process of reaping the enemy's lives, while the 200 desolate man warriors near the north quickly followed the two teams of cavalrymen and rushed to the periphery. However, at the moment when the cloud covered the sun and the shadow covered the grassland, the desolate man warriors suddenly found that they could no longer catch up with the grassland cavalrymen who had driven to the periphery and began to wander along the big circle and shoot arrows again. Because their most terrifying running speed had suddenly slowed down a lot. The reason why the running speed of the desolate man warriors slowed down was that the hard grassland under their feet suddenly became soft. The uprooted grass roots gradually seeped into the mud, and the broken weapons left on the surface of the grass began to sink into the mud. Their feet were also sinking. When they ran, their feet stepped heavily into the grassland, and it took a lot of effort to pull them out. The grassland in the center of the battlefield seemed to have become a swamp. The desolate man warriors who had been silent and determined finally had a change of expression at this moment. They firmly believed that they could win all the battles, but today they had entered the battle that the grassland cavalrymen had planned, and they did not know what would happen next. Although the surface of the grassland they were in had turned into a soft swamp, and it was not like quicksand that could swallow people and horses. It was difficult for them to keep their balance on the soft ground. Their legs were deeply sunk into the ground, and they could not exert their terrifying running speed. For thousands of years, they had been chasing snow wolves and snow deer by the boundless hot sea. The desolate man's feet had become tireless, fast, and extremely durable wolf feet. They were their most powerful weapons. However, today their weapons suddenly became useless. They could not catch up with the grassland cavalrymen who were wandering around. What was more terrifying was that they could no longer avoid arrows like before, or at least prevent the enemy's arrows from hitting their vital parts. Swoosh swoosh. The palace cavalrymen who had wandered to the periphery of the grassland regrouped as fast as they could. They divided into two groups of more than 1,000 cavalrymen and galloped in opposite directions at high speed. At the same time, they knocked their bows and shot arrows at the desolate man warriors who were surrounded in the middle. With a puff, a sharp arrow shot into the chest of a young desolate man. He frowned in pain and pulled out the arrow from his chest. However, before he could raise the long knife in his hand, a second arrow, a third arrow, and more arrows shot into his body. Finally, the young man slowly knelt on the ground with his eyes wide open, unwilling and painful. His knees sank into the soft ground, and then he fell forward. I adjusted my biological clock so much that I wanted to die. There were 4 blackouts in the afternoon, which made me feel like I wanted to die. I was afraid that there would be another blackout later, so I wrote 3,000 words and updated it first. There will be another chapter later. Also, the monthly ticket will be doubled from the 29th. This, we will talk about it later. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 184. The sky darkened and the grassland turned into a swamp. No matter how strong the desolate man warriors were, they would lose their most important ability once they could not run as fast and long as the wolves by the hot sea. In the eyes of the grassland cavalrymen, they suddenly became immovable targets. No matter how strong their close-range defense was, they would eventually die of blood exhaustion after being shot by countless arrows. Of course, if they wanted to use arrows to kill these tough desolate man warriors, even if they did not dodge, they would still need a terrifying number of arrows. No cavalryman would carry so many arrows in a normal war. However, during the days when the desolate man went south, dozens of tribes in the left king's court had been defeated. The grassland people had learned from their failures and finally decided on today's war strategy. The palace had sent one of the 7 great sorcerers and the elite cavalrymen. How could there be a shortage of arrows? The horses moved like the wind and the arrows fell like rain. The grassland cavalrymen whistled and kicked the horse's abdomen. With their exquisite shooting skills, they accurately pulled their bows and shot arrows. The desolate man warriors who were surrounded in the middle of the swamp-like grassland struggled to pull their legs out of the grass and mud. They struggled to move their legs and trudged to the periphery. However, the second step they took was also stuck in the mud. Coupled with the accurate and terrifying arrows, the desolate man's speed of breaking through the encirclement was extremely slow. One of the most powerful warriors did not care that his body was full of arrows and bravely stepped through the thick mud. When he was less than 20 steps away from the grassland cavalryman, he was shot in the knee and fell in despair with a muffled groan. Suddenly encountering such a strange ambush, the old veteran among the desolate man warriors had long noticed the strange carriage behind the grassland cavalryman and the strange people in it. He guessed that the sudden change in the grassland must have something to do with the carriage. He only heard the old man shout a few words and then a desolate man warrior with extremely thick arms walked over with difficulty and stood in front of him. The desolate man veteran pressed his palm on the back of the warrior and groaned. His face gradually turned pale and an inexplicable huge force passed through his palm into the warrior's body. The desolate warrior's arms became thicker, as if something had entered his body. He forcibly endured the pain from his skin and ignored the blood flowing out from the corner of his eyes. He stared at the carriage in the distance and suddenly let out a beast-like roar. He pulled out a big axe from his waist and threw it in that direction. The sound of the axe tearing through the air rang out. Under the support of the enormous power, the axe was like a bolt of lightning, traversing a distance of several hundred feet in an instant, chopping towards the golden-robed old royal court wizard on the carriage. Seeing the sharp axe whistling towards him, the two valiant warriors of the royal court, who had been standing silently by the old magus side, raised the giant shields at their feet at the most crucial moment, blocking in front of the old magus. The tip of the axe violently collided with the giant metal shield, producing a loud and clear clang. The grassland soldiers beside the chariot were so shocked that they covered their ears and knelt on the ground. The gorgeous carriage only shook slightly before returning to normal. In the carriage, the old magus who was sitting on the metal plate was still expressionless. He hurriedly chanted incantations and the wrinkles on his face deepened. The chi of heaven and earth around him entered the metal plate with his incantation and then followed the talisman patterns that were as complicated as star lines into the ground of the grassland. It was then released by another metal plate that the royal court had buried in the ground in front of them, causing the grassland above to become softer and softer. The desolate man's last hope of escaping was dashed. They raised their heavy long knives and desperately tried to break out of the encirclement in the soft mud. There were people who were hit by dozens of arrows and fell down like thorns. The grassland cavalrymen who were shooting arrows around them whistled more and more sharply. Their ferocious faces were filled with the joy of revenge. The wet grass, the bloody mud, and the galloping horses formed a cruel and desperate picture. The grassland suddenly became quiet and spacious. The cruel shooting of arrows was still going on, but other than the buzzing of strings and the sound of arrows piercing through the air, as well as the sharp whistles of the grassland cavalrymen, no other sound could be heard. The desolate man somehow stopped and buried their bodies in the grass as low as possible. They silently defended and no longer tried to break out of the encirclement. Then even the buzzing of strings, the whistling of arrows, and the sharp whistles of the grassland cavalrymen all disappeared. The battlefield that was supposed to be chaotic became extremely quiet. Quiet was actually a relative term. In fact, the reason why all the chaotic sounds disappeared was that the people on the battlefield could only hear one sound. It was the low vibrating sound of a heavy object piercing through the air at high speed. It was definitely not an arrow, but a flying sword used by the people of the Central Plains. It sounded more like a huge stone that was thrown down from the clouds by Hautian and was constantly accelerating. The desolate man soldiers who were buried in the grass raised their heads with difficulty and looked up at the sky. They had been mentally prepared to face death with equanimity. Their eyes had previously become extremely calm, but now they were suddenly filled with passion and admiration. The grassland cavalrymen who were wandering around the battlefield in the center of the grassland felt a wave of fear in their hearts. They subconsciously slowed down the speed of drawing their bows and looked up in shock. Everyone on both sides of the battle raised their heads. They looked at the place where the horrifying vibrating sound came from. The clouds blocked the sunlight and cast a shadow. In the shadow under the clouds, a man fell from the sky. He streaked across the sky, his body covered in blood like flames. He fell from a height of tens of meters, as if he had jumped down from the clouds. His terrifying speed broke through the air around his body, creating a semispherical mist. Perhaps it was because of the intense friction between his legs, there were blood-like flames splashing out. The man was like a meteorite that smashed into the earth. The place where the meteorite fell was the gorgeous carriage of the left king's palace on the grassland. The two most powerful warriors in the palace on the carriage roared and raised their heavy giant shields to block the head of the old wizard. The old sorcerer's hands trembled violently, and the psyche power in his sea of consciousness gushed out, mobilizing the chi of heaven and earth around him to quickly gather. Then, he raised his head, and through the gap between the shields, he saw a foot. The foot was wearing a very ordinary leather boot. The leather boot was a little old and the bottom of the boot was a little dirty. He didn't know which grassland, which gobi, which sewage, and which mountains and rivers he had stepped on. The moment he saw this foot, the old wizard of the royal court understood a truth. Death had come. The man who fell like a meteorite stepped on the hard metal giant shield. The old soles of the boots couldn't withstand such a huge force and cracked inch by inch. However, the hard metal giant shield also cracked inch by inch. The two powerhouses of the royal court who were holding the giant shield up didn't even have time to groan. Their thick arms were directly turned into silk-like muscles under the unstoppable and terrifying force. The white bones that were just exposed instantly turned into powder. Blood spurted out from their noses, eyes, ears, and mouths like arrows. The foot that had no soles broke the giant shield and continued to descend among the flying metal fragments. It easily broke the old wizard's condensed chi shield and stepped on his head. The old sorcerer's lifeless eyes were stomped directly into his neck. Then, the foot continued downward and stepped on his body. The old sorcerer's body suddenly sank and flattened until it became a pile of meat paste. The foot in the leather boot continued to descend. It broke the old wizard's meat paste. It broke the hard metal disc. It broke the broken carriage board. There was a loud bang. Dust and blood and meat powder splashed everywhere. Smoke and dust flew everywhere. The luxurious carriage turned into a pile of rubbish. The sharp metal fragments shot dozens of grassland soldiers standing around the carriage and fell to the ground. The foot that broke through the clouds and tore through the air finally stepped on the grassland that the barbarians had occupied for nearly 1,000 years. A middle-aged man in a leather robe stood in the middle of the ruins with a blood-red giant knife on his back. He looked expressionlessly at the grassland barbarians who were stunned like statues. The desolate soldiers who were trapped in the grassland swamp looked at the powerful man in the distance. They finally broke the silence and let out a crazy roar. Some young desolate people were so excited that they even shed tears. Somewhere in the deep mountains in the south, there was a Taoist temple that looked extremely simple. Because it was remote, there were no tourists or believers who came here. Naturally, there were no incense offerings. The Taoists in the temple didn't like incense either. They felt that the smell was extremely vulgar. It was even different from what ordinary Taoist Haotian thought. The Taoists who lived in this old temple didn't even care about incense money. In the depths of the Taoist temple, there were 7 thatched cottages beside a quiet lake. They were different from the simple and even shabby feeling of this Taoist temple. Although the eaves of these 7 cottages were covered with thatch, they gave people an extremely luxurious and solemn feeling. The roots of the thatch were yellow and white like gold and jade. No one knew how many years they had been through, but they were still as fresh as before. In the first cottage, there was a large and thick classic quietly placed on the agarwood table by the window. The cover was as black as coagulated blood. It also looked like a black blood stone that was formed after hundreds of millions of years. There was a word "re" written on it. The classic had been opened. The pen that was full of ink moved slowly and smoothly to the right to write a line. The middle-aged Taoist put down his pen and looked at it for a moment. He nodded with satisfaction. There were 2 words written on the blank paper. That was someone's name. Ning Quebec Ching Fong couldn't read, but he could help condense the ink and leave the words on the paper. After a while, a breeze blew in from outside the window. The pages of the book rustled and kept turning forward. No one knew how many pages had been turned. The classic with the word "re" written on the cover finally flipped to the front from the page with the word "Ning K" written on it. The first page of the classic was completely blank like snow. There were a few names on the second page. Lu Bai's name was at the top. Not far away, one could vaguely see the word June. There was a person's name on the paper that was different from all the other names. It was extremely lonely and yet extremely powerful. It was as if he was not willing to stand together with the powerful people of the Central Plains who were famous and powerful. Because he was the world wayfarer of the devil's doctrine. He was the strongest person in the northern wilderness. His name was Tang. When I was designing the night, I told many people that I wanted to write what I thought was cool. Today's foot is what I thought was cool. It's really easy to feel good writing like this. I hope you can feel good too. It's past midnight. Call for recommendation votes. As for the monthly votes, sigh, I will definitely open the chapter tomorrow. When that time comes, everyone will be happy. Just try your best to vote for me when the votes are doubled tomorrow. Good night. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation votes and monthly votes. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 185. The middle-aged Taoist closed the classics and walked out of the hut slowly with his hands behind his back. He looked at his companion and said, I didn't expect so many people of the younger generation to be on the hand scroll. The Taoist asked in confusion, who's on the hand scroll today? Ning Quebec, this name sounds familiar. Is he the scholar of the academy who defeated Longqing? Yes. Although he hasn't entered the see-through state, he has already comprehended Tao and is qualified to be on the hand scroll. The Taoist was slightly stunned and then praised, the headmaster of the academy is really great. Yes. The first Taoist shook his head and said with mixed emotions, although the headmaster of the academy wasn't in Chang, and when he entered the second floor of the academy, he is his student after all. He started to learn talisman Taoism at such a young age. I believe his name will appear on the first few pages of the hand scroll in 10 years. After that, the Taoist said goodbye to his companions and walked along the edge of the quiet lake in front of the thatched cottage. Along the way, he was accompanied by the scenery of the lake, the mountains, and the forest. It didn't take long for him to walk out of the Taoist temple. Facing the cool breeze that blew from the cliff, the Taoist narrowed his eyes and looked at the faintly visible mountain in the distance, as well as the majestic Taoist temples in the mountain. He smiled, and his smile was full of serenity. The simple and old Taoist temple behind him was quiet, as if it was also quietly watching the prosperity and nobility of the world over there. There was an old horizontal board on the Taoist temple, which had been left countless traces by wind and rain. The board said, Ji Shou. Hundreds of kilometers to the east was the Sea of Storms. After the terrifying hurricane of the 4 seasons came ashore, it passed through the obstruction of the hills and rivers and turned into a light breeze. It was moist and cool, but it did not have any destructive power. Therefore, the summer here was not as stuffy as it was in Chang'an. This country was not large and was not prosperous because of the lack of commercial development. There were not many idlers except for those devout believers who kowtowed and walked around the mountains to worship heaven. However, the dangerous hurricanes turned into light breezes and drizzles here. The mountains were beautiful but not high, the water was gentle but not turbulent, there were fertile plains and forests filled with deers. It was really a place favored by Haotian. Because of the beautiful hills in the west, it was named West Hill. The mountain that could be seen from the Jishou Abbey was called Peach Mountain. Although the peach blossoms on the mountain had been cut down by someone many years ago, thanks to Haotian's favor, the soil was fertile, and the peach blossoms had been in full bloom from early spring to late summer. The peach blossoms planted on the mountain had been in full bloom from early spring to late summer, lush and dazzling. There were several neat and smooth cliff plateaus on the Peach Mountain, as if they were carved out by the divine power of heaven with a giant axe. Numerous Taoist temples of different styles were built on the cliff plateaus, which formed a group of magnificent and solemn temples. They were the divine halls of West Hill. The divine temple was built on the Peach Mountain and was divided into 3 levels. On the upper cliff plateau closest to the sky, there were 4 most spectacular Taoist temples. Among them, the Taoist temple near the cliff edge was built with huge black stones. Its shape was not like ordinary Taoist buildings. It looked at the believers who kowtowed on the mountain road with eternal indifference. The main hall of the Black Taoist temple was extremely spacious and grand. There was a curtain made of pearls and jade hundreds of meters deep. Behind the curtain was a divine throne carved from the black jade of the South Sea. One of the three divine priests of the Haotian divine sect, the great divine priest of judgment, usually sat under this divine throne to listen to the reports of his subordinate priests and deal with the affairs of Haotian Taoism. The great divine priest of judgment wore a red divine robe. Today, he did not order his subordinates to lift the bead curtain. Instead, he looked at the curtain expressionlessly, as if he wanted to see all the pearls and jade on it turn into powder. As one of the three divine priests of the West Hill Divine Palace, the great divine priest of judgment was in charge of judgment. He was in charge of the most terrible and violent organization in Haotian Taoism. He had the most powerful cultivators in Haotian Taoism. On the surface, he was the most powerful and had the most terrible reputation in the world. For countless years, many heretics had been secretly arrested because of his words, and many remnants of the devil's doctrine had become ghosts in the fire because of his little finger. In the eyes of hundreds of millions of people in the world, the Haotian hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace might not be as terrible as this great divine priest of judgment in a red divine robe. There had even been a rumor that the reason why the great divine priest of judgment did not use the main color of the judicial department was that his robe was bright red instead of pure black, because it was stained with the blood of all his enemies. Such a great divine priest, who was at the peak of the human world and possessed supreme and terrifying authority, when his face was expressionless and his eyes were indifferent, not to mention the bead curtain in front of him would be scared into powder. Even those great sword masters who held swords and walked in the human world without fear of the royal power would be scared to the point that their hearts would break. However, today, the bead curtain in front of the great divine priest of judgment was not broken. The person on the other side of the bead curtain was not scared to kneel on the ground, but still stood calmly. The bead curtain covered the body and face of the person outside the curtain. Only a pair of shoes at the bottom could be seen. The shoes were dark red like blood, embroidered with a few small fish, and the extremely fluffy red skirt hanging down to the knees. It was obviously a woman. The great divine priest of judgment looked away from the corner of the red skirt and slowly raised his head. He asked expressionlessly, "Why hasn't Long Qing come back yet?" The woman outside the curtain replied, "Why hasn't that coward Long Qing come back? How would I know? I have never been in charge of human affairs since I took charge of the judicial department. Why do you ask me, uncle?" The crisp voice sounded clearer through the bead curtain. She should be young and still a young girl. The great divine priest of judgment slightly lowered his eyes and said, "Ning Kei's name appeared on the hand scroll." The girl outside the curtain was silent for a moment and then said with slight sarcasm, "Ning Kei is Long Qing's opponent. If he can't even kill such a little reptile in a no-doubt state, do you still expect me to do it? I will take it as an insult." The light in the eyes of the great divine priest of judgment suddenly shone and then quickly disappeared. He said without emotion, "Long Qing was defeated by this person. Of course, he has to win personally to restore his Taoist heart. But I must remind you that although this person is still in the no-doubt state and is just an inconspicuous reptile in your eyes, he has entered the second floor of the academy and become a student of the headmaster of academy. Even if you pay attention to him in advance, it is not an insult. Learning talisman Taoism from Uncle Yen Sei does not necessarily mean that he can become the second Uncle Yen Sei. I think at least now he is not qualified to be worthy of my attention." The girl in red outside the curtain proudly said, "Uncle, you should be very clear that my goal has always been Jun Mo. Others are not qualified to distract me. Jun Mo, the second disciple of the academy." The great divine priest of judgment softly sighed with a trace of sarcasm on his old face. No one knew whether he was mocking the girl outside the curtain or other ignorant people. A few years ago, the hierarch lord took you back to the ceremony. You had the opportunity to see the hand scroll. After you saw the name of Jun Mo, you have been unable to calm down. Because you can't imagine how there can be such a cultivation genius in the world that far surpasses you, so you always want to surpass this enemy you have never met. The great divine priest of judgment looked at the girl in red outside the curtain and said indifferently, "You said that others are not qualified to distract you, but have you ever thought about this? Even I and your brother dare not say that they will win Jun Mo. What qualifications do you have to be his opponent? How can you exist in the eyes of the incomparably proud second brother of the academy?" As the voice fell, a gust of wind blew from somewhere in the Peach Mountain, passing through the empty and magnificent hall. The bead curtain in the depths of the hall gently swayed and made a crisp sound. Outside the swaying bead curtain, the lace on the girl's red dress could be vaguely seen rising in the wind. The most powerful priest under his command was angry because of being despised, but the great divine priest of judgment seemed not to notice it. He continued expressionlessly, "Recently, the situation in the wilderness seems to be a bit unstable. The desolate men continue to move south. I don't know where they will step in the end. The hierarch lord is worried that the remnants of the devil's doctrine will take advantage of the situation to rise again. The sign on the tomes of arcane is about to be issued. The judicial department will naturally go first." You immediately set off for the north. The girl in red outside the curtain was obviously a little surprised. After a moment of silence, she said, "After all, it is just a small matter. I am anxious to cultivate in the mountain and break the realm. Uncle, please choose another candidate." The great divine priest of judgment calmly looked at the girl's figure outside the curtain and said, "The divine hall recognizes your talent and perseverance in cultivation. So when you deliberately angered Chinpipi to leave the West Hill and your brother wanted to kill you with his sword, the hierarch lord and I saved you at all costs. But you need to know that talent and perseverance are not absolute guarantees of pride. Your brother is proud and calm. Jun Mo is proud and dull. That is because they have long stood at the peak of the young generation in the world. They have the strength to be proud. Whether it is you or Long Qing, although you are good enough, you are not in that absolutely powerful field. As long as someone is sure to defeat you, you have no right to be proud. Because this kind of pride without absolute guarantee of strength will be a great obstacle to the cultivation of your Taoist heart. Absolutely believe that what you believe is right. Faith can be firm. Absolutely believe that no one can defeat you. Pride can be firm.